It's a rather auspicious day today, Friday, June 13th, 2025. They say that Friday the 13th means bad luck, but this Friday the 13th is special as it marks the 25-year anniversary since the North American release of The Legend of Dragoon. And this is a game that's very near and dear to me, as you can tell by that f***ing time bar. I've wanted to make a video about this game on this channel for quite a while, but as much as I've wanted to, my attitude has always been, well, who the hell wants to hear me talk about that? But 25 years? Well, milestones like that don't happen every day, so screw it. It's one of my favorite games of all time, and I don't want to miss an opportunity like this, whether 5 people watch or 5 million people watch. Let's go. So what is The Legend of Dragoon? Well, it's a PlayStation JRPG from the turn of the millennium. JRPGs are something I've never really been into. For one thing, the general gameplay usually doesn't click with me, and then there's my general antipathy for JRPG stories, which is an extension of my own antipathy for anime. Still, Legend of Dragoon has always been the exception to that rule for me from day one. Something about it has always clicked with me in a way that very few JRPGs and, quite frankly, very few games ever clicked. And why is that? Well, to be honest, as I've gotten older, I've kinda come to realize I don't really have an answer to that. Nostalgia aside, theoretically, this should be everything I hate about games, and yet it's one of my favorite games, and one that I will have an urge to come back to again and again. I don't know, and I guess I don't care. All I know is it's something that's been a favorite of mine for most of my life, and as a matter of fact, this might also take the cake for being the game that I have the most personal history with. I got this game back when I was 6 years old. It was among some of the first PS1 games I owned, and I jumped straight from NES to PS1, so it blew my mind. Of course, as some of you may know, my first PS1 game I played was Spyro the Dragon, and I didn't actually play The Legend of Dragoon for quite a while, and why is that? Well, because I was a good Christian boy who didn't even say the F word until I was 10 years old, and this was a T-rated game. I didn't want to get in trouble with my parents, so for quite a long time all I did was backseat the game with my older siblings. And even then I was enraptured with the game and its world. It was something more grand than anything I'd ever seen in my life, and when I finally did get around to playing it, man, it was magical. I think the first time I played it would have been the summer of '08, but my memories are a bit more vague about this one. Unfortunately, I do remember I didn't beat the game. I got up to Xenobados and couldn't get past the 3 judges. I do distinctly remember the first time I beat it though. That came out wrong. It was November of 2012. Imagine this. You're a slightly depressed, socially awkward 15-year-old skateboarder who's been struggling socially and educationally, and you decide, you know what, I've got nothing else better to do, I'm gonna beat that game I grew up with, he says as he's growing up. Up to that point, nobody in my family had beaten the game, despite most of us having played it at some point or other. 45 hours later, and that was that, and I will always remember sitting in my living room watching those end credits roll at 2 AM. It's a spiritual experience that you can only have for the first time once. 4 years later, I played it again because I was recovering from invasive surgery and suddenly had a lot of time on my hands. After that, there was a period in my life where I played it at least once a year for like 5 or 6 years. Not so much these days because I felt I overplayed it, but still it's something I think about quite often. And what's funny is, while this game is fairly obscure, well, there's an old saying, perception is reality, and I perceived this game as a very big deal growing up because it blew my mind in a way that the only other comparison would be the way that Final Fantasy VII blew so many people's minds, and it's convenient that I bring up Final Fantasy. As the saying goes, history is written by the victors, and so when it comes to Japanese RPGs, Final Fantasy, at least in North America, is king of the mountain and has remained that way for at least the majority of its existence. Regardless of individual game quality or popularity, as far as pure marketability, Final Fantasy is the most consistently well-known Japanese RPG property out there without a doubt. And when it comes to Final Fantasy, the crown jewel has been Final Fantasy VII for a really long time. Once again, it's not everyone's cup of tea. Some people prefer 6, I have a soft spot for 12 for some reason. But when you ask people to name a JRPG, people to this day will name Final Fantasy VII more often than not. It is the most well-known example to most people, so why am I bringing up Final Fantasy in a video about The Legend of Dragoon? Well, because it's kind of impossible to talk about The Legend of Dragoon without talking about Final Fantasy. Honestly, it's impossible to talk about any JRPG from this era without bringing up Final Fantasy, because it's an inevitable comparison. How can you attempt to make something so specific as a JRPG without inviting comparison to the most popular example of the genre? The Legend of Dragoon was obviously Sony's attempt at making their own Final Fantasy game. Whether they intended it as competition, whether it was supposed to be a one-off, whether it was supposed to be a franchise, either way, it was a big game in the same genre, so 2 + 2 is 4. And they poured a lot of resources into making the game what it was, which is something they proudly boast on the back of the box. But despite their best efforts, they were never able to compete, and they ended up making a relatively successful game, but in the grand scope of time, it ended up with niche status. So why did the game never get the recognition it maybe deserved, and did it deserve better? Well, as one of the self-proclaimed biggest fans of the game on the internet, I'm here to tell you that. And this is a game that wastes no time in grabbing your attention. That is a very evocative intro, and the funny thing is, those vague, mysterious lines of text aren't meaningless drivel. It's actually in very few words conveying the overall themes of the game. When the clash of swords echo, the journey chasing the past ends and the journey to know today begins. One soul seeks another and pledges their sworn friendship to another. One mystery begets the next, and the doors of fate are opened. You are free to sever the chains of fate that bind you. All of it is actually relevant. When the clash of swords echo, I take that to mean the clash of swords echoing through time, referencing the inciting incident to the entire history of the game, the Dragon campaign 11,000 years previous. The journey chasing the past ends and the journey to know today begins. A large theme running throughout the game is people stuck in the past, and whether by choice or by force, having to leave behind the pain and sorrow of the past to confront the present and create a better future. One soul seeks another and pledges their sworn friendship to another. That's obviously referencing the main character Dart and his relationship with his childhood friend cum love interest Shauna, and no matter what, he will move heaven and earth to keep her safe. One soul seeks another in the sense that he's seeking her for a lot of the game, as she's very important to the main overall plot. And as such, there's a long-standing battle for the fate of Shauna. And it's fitting they use the word soul in that line because Shauna's soul is very relevant. One mystery begets the next, and the doors of fate are opened. That's easy. This is a game with an ever-evolving story and dozens of individual moving pieces that are all connected. And you're not sure what the story is or how it all connects until the big revelation, at which point the doors of fate are opened, and you are free to sever the chains of fate that bind you. That's another theme this game plays around with, which is breaking the cycle and taking fate into your own hands. These are all things you only realize in hindsight after you play the game, possibly not even once but multiple times, and so it's an effective intro that really grips you from the start. It may seem like word salad, and in a way it sort of is, but it's a carefully chosen word salad that conveys a lot. But I just threw a bunch of names at you, so I should probably start explaining what The Legend of Dragoon is about, but that's a loaded question. This is a game that came on 4 discs, and while a good chunk of that can be blamed on the gorgeous CGI cutscenes, this is also a very large game. And with that comes a very large story, but what you need to know at the start is this. Every 108 years, this creature called the Black Monster shows up and wreaks havoc on the world. Why is that? Well, we can't talk about that just yet, so hold on to your butts. The Black Monster has been wreaking havoc consistently for 11,000 years leading up to the events of the game. In said events, the protagonist of the story, Dart Feld, was a victim of the Black Monster when it attacked his town when he was no more than 5 years old. In the process, he lost both his parents. After being taken in by a family in a town called Celeste, Dart grows up dreaming of revenge. So after 13 years at the age of 18, he decides to set off on a 5-year journey to try and find the Black Monster, leaving behind Shauna, who was a girl that he grew up alongside in Celeste and was essentially his little sister. But upon his return to Celeste 5 years later, the town is attacked and Shauna is taken prisoner by a local empire. So Dart must go out to rescue her, and the story unfolds thusly. Along his journey, he meets many companions who would become party members, from Hashel to Rose to Miru. Until I'm ready to discuss the story more in depth, that's all I'm gonna say on the matter. So if you know the story and think it's a bad summary, good. That's the absolute minimum amount of spoilers I can give to discuss the rest of the game before spoiling the story. So let's back way the f*** up. So the big question at this point is, how do I attack this game? It's like, if you give me a 5-pound burger, how do you decide which is the correct spot to take the first bite? Well, I guess the best place to start would be JRPGs generally. What is it about JRPG gameplay that I generally don't like? Well, in a lot of cases, it's the slow-paced, turn-based gameplay. There have been times in my personal history where I've held my nose through JRPGs that I otherwise wouldn't have bothered with just because they had real-time combat. But when it comes to menu and turn-based games for me, that is automatically a massive turnoff, and so the rest of the game needs to compensate 10 times harder to keep me interested, because if I'm not engaged in the gameplay, how do I enjoy a game? Some people like the stat building and customization of these types of games. Some people like the visual spectacle as well, but for me, what it comes down to is this. If the moment-to-moment gameplay is simply navigating lists, I'm not interested. This, on the other hand, is turn-based, so what in the name of hypocrisy makes it stick out to me so much? Why is this not only a JRPG combat system I can tolerate, but one that I would consider to be one of my favorite games of all time? Well, that's because this game is turn-based, but it also has an element of real-time combat to it that makes it transcend the simple binary of real-time and turn-based. It turns the knob a couple of degrees, enough to make it go from boring to awesome. If you've ever heard of this game, chances are good the one thing that you would have heard about would be, well, Miru, because this is the internet. But the other thing would have to be this, the addition system. This is the unique selling point of the gameplay, which propels it from being a dime a dozen turn-based combat engine into being one of the more unique and uniquely compelling combat engines you'll ever see. And the aspect that makes it unique to me makes it awesome. Here's the deal, every time you get into battle, each character with the exception of the bow users have what's called additions. Additions are a fancy word for combos. You can go into the menu and select whatever addition you currently have unlocked, and so in battle, when it's time to attack, each addition is its own unique animation, and every time you attack, whether it be punching, slashing, or stabbing, 2 indicators will show up on screen. The bigger indicator will gradually spin and shrink until it aligns with the smaller indicator, and at that point, you're supposed to press the X button to continue the combo until you finish off the combo, at which point your character will yell whatever the combo name is, from Cool Boogie to Rod Typhoon to my personal favorite, Blazing Dynamo! In fact, totally embarrassing confession. I've thought about this. If I was a pro wrestler, my finishing move would literally be called the Blazing Dynamo. I was never athletic enough to go into wrestling, but I'd imagine the Moonstrike Lariat, which is basically just a clothesline from hell which would set up the Blazing Dynamo, which would be an Argentine DDT. Matter of fact, among other try-hard stage names like Crusher Mason, one of my potential names would have been Braxton Feld, a tribute to Dart, once again whose last name is Feld. In fact, starting to count myself lucky that I never did this. I would have been made fun of on so many wrestling podcasts. Now, the addition system at first glance doesn't seem very glamorous. As a matter of fact, in keeping with the fact that me liking this game is grounds for complete and utter contradiction, this entire system is basically QuickTime events before QuickTime events were even a coined phrase, as this game predated Shenmue by a couple of weeks. Is it Shenmue or Shenmue? But if I had to put a stamp on it and really examine what it is that makes me enjoy this particular crack at QTEs, I think it's the way the game dresses them up and makes it a compelling and fun system of gameplay. What could have easily been a system of gameplay where you half-heartedly press the button at the correct time has something like 9 levels of nuance to it that makes it awesome. I think the primary difference between this and general QuickTime events is the fact that QuickTime events in a lot of ways feel like arbitrarily adding gameplay to cutscenes where there didn't need to be any. Meanwhile, this comes across more as just a unique combat engine. It starts off relatively simple. Most first combos that people have are just one button press, but the system gradually escalates through the game as you become more and more accustomed to the combos. You see, the only way to unlock the final addition for every character is to level every single addition up to level 5. To do so, you need to successfully pull off every addition 80 times. Given the game's length, you're not going to be strapped for time, and this happens quickly enough that you move on from the easiest additions within an hour or two. And the thing is, you're not penalized for missing the additions in the same way that you would be for quicktime events. You just end up doing less damage, but pulling off the addition works towards a larger overall goal of getting to that major final attack. And each subsequent addition is harder to pull off and more skillful than the last. So as you get used to one attack, you have to move on to the next attack, which becomes harder and more gratifying to pull off. It's a bit paradoxical in the sense that it encourages you to move on to your next attack just as the current attack becomes its most powerful. But that's part of its appeal, is that there's a bit of a risk-reward factor to it, because if your stats aren't optimized properly, switching to a new attack may end up being the difference maker that screws you. But there's also nothing stopping you from sticking to your guns. But either way, it's a system of gameplay that encourages you to get out of your comfort zone. It encourages you to experience the escalation of required skill. And there's a certain intensity to the way these additions play out by the end. I'm hanging on every single button press trying to get the most I can possibly get out of my attacks. And I think getting that timing down and really mastering a complicated sequence of button presses is, to be quite frank, a very rewarding experience in my opinion. Matter of fact, this doesn't even remind me of QuickTime events. To my mind, it comes across more as a rhythm game. It's like, remember the rush of endorphins you would get when you finally cleared that really hard song on Guitar Hero that was giving you trouble? This game is basically a drip feed of that feeling for many hours. But it also doesn't overload you in that sense. It doesn't make every single battle a sort of do-or-die bombastic exercise of life and death. And I feel like it would get tiresome in that case. It bases itself so you have a moderate level of enjoyment of every individual battle, with the boss fights being the exciting climax in every area that makes the most of the systems. So it keeps itself enjoyable, but with peaks and valleys that keeps the special moments special and keeps you engaged. It helps that there's a lot of variety to the system in the sense that every character has multiple of them, and each character has different strengths and abilities that their additions give them. So while the system is at its base level, just pressing buttons to a rhythm, the combination of presentation, context, and escalation makes it a system wherein it's one of the few hybrid real-time turn-based combat engines that I can think of that completely works. It manages that elusive feat of being simple while also being challenging, so you can immediately pick it up and understand exactly what the game expects of you, but within its simple premise hides a level of depth and challenge that you wouldn't expect. And the idea that you're constantly working towards an overall goal is the thing that keeps me going. You see, for me, the secret to compelling gameplay is that I don't like playing a game just for the sake of playing a game. I like to have something I'm working towards. In a lot of cases, a story is enough of something to work towards, but if I've already played a game, or if I'm, say, in New Game Plus mode, the thing that I'm working towards can be something else. Getting all the upgrades, unlocking something, 100% completion if I'm really into the game. If there's not at least something worth working towards, I find the game loses something, and in this case, they're dangling the final additions in front of me. And admittedly, the game does kind of lose something for me towards the end when the selection of characters that you've chosen have all their final additions upgraded to level 5. But by that point, you're pretty late into the game, and the final stages of the story should be enough to keep you engaged. Keep in mind though, that since this is most applicable to a rhythm game, your setup will determine the timing. Even something as simple as switching the game from one monitor to another might throw off your timing. The size of your TV, the refresh rate, these are things you need to keep in mind. Even the game's performance might change slightly from area to area depending on how demanding the background is. So I recommend not changing this setup at all from the beginning of the game to the end, because then you're forced to get used to a new setup and therefore different timing. I think the only flaw with the addition system, which is more so a flaw with the lack of quality of life features that come with modern design sensibilities, is that changing your additions can be a bit tedious. First of all, you need to pause the game when you're not in combat, then you need to go to the addition menu and scroll over to whatever character it is you need to change the addition for. So it's not a long process, but it's long enough, and half the time I end up forgetting that I have to switch attacks until I'm in battle, but by that point it's too late. Personally, I wish I could just select whatever addition I want while I'm attacking. That's such a no-brainer. They go out of their way to explain that you can't change additions once you're in battle, so it's not something they overlooked. That was a conscious design choice. That said, it's also worth mentioning that the enemies won't just stick around and let you attack them. They will protect themselves. And this is what I feel is the monkey wrench that kind of helps escalate this combat engine, which is occasionally enemies will throw out a counterattack prompt, at which point instead of pressing the X button at the correct time, you have to press the circle button at the correct time. Failure to do so will result in your combo ending and will result in taking a bit of damage. So memorizing the potential places for counterattack prompts to come up and countering the counterattack properly is paramount. And some of these counterattacks can be blatantly unfair. In particular, for Albert's and Lavitz's final edition, there's a potential counterattack window that comes up which is less than a second before the next input. And because the screen pauses whether you successfully fend off the counterattack or not, if you do it properly, you have to memorize the exact moment the game starts back up after a counterattack window and apply that directly to the timing of the addition. Even without moments like that, the timing can be really tough. Even early on, you may find yourself with split-second counter windows, meaning you have to be on your toes all the time. Mastering that timing and memorizing the potential attack window is no easy feat. It's difficult to get down, but you feel like a god if you can pull it off properly, because there's no earthly way you should be able to pull that off. The counterattacks can become more of a nuisance as the game goes on, but I would consider them good frustrating. The type of frustrating that inspires you to lock in, lean closer to the TV, and master the game just to show it a lesson. But that's also partially due to the fact that I find this game enjoyable at a base level, so any sort of monkey wrench it throws at me is more icing on the cake. Variety for this sort of thing is a good thing. And the funny part is, failure to take out an enemy in one go may end up costing you, because every enemy has 3 health states, above 50%, 49% to 25%, and below 25%, shown by the color of their indicator. And I believe almost every enemy in the game has a Hail Mary attack if they're below 25% health, which can be a real thorn in your side depending on the enemy. So if you don't take out every enemy as quickly as possible, and it's their turn and they have less than 25% health, it can be a real issue. Not every enemy has a catastrophically consequential final attack, but some of them do. Like, for example, I remember during my first full playthrough, I found that right before the final boss, there are these standard enemies that look like weird monks, and if they fall below 25% health, they'll use a random magic item on you. And in this case, they just so happened to select the psychedelic bomb, which makes no sense story-wise because we're supposed to be the only ones who have that. But more to the point, most powerful magic attack in the game, inadequate magical defense, we all die in one hit. I especially hate the attacks that give you status ailments like confusion or bewitchment, so you have to be thorough with your combat, and part of being thorough is making sure you can do as much damage as possible, and part of that is mastering the counterattacks. And I enjoy the fact that even to this day, I've never really been able to fully master this system. I can still reliably find myself failing some of the more difficult to deal with additions or counterattacks. Sure, you can mitigate this by focusing on magic or dragoons, but it's all worth it to me, even if it isn't necessarily the best way to play. As a matter of fact, I find that I tend to play this game suboptimally, if only because I prefer just doing the additions over doing such things as casting magic spells or turning into my dragoon form, because I'm just enjoying the ride that the main chunk of the gameplay gives me. It kind of goes back to that thing about how I don't play games for speed, I play games for fun, and if you prefer to play games fast, that's fair enough. But that's no more or less valid than the ways anybody else may enjoy a game. I remember even seeing one person who went out of their way to have the least powerful weapons in the game specifically because they wanted to play the game for longer, and that's a viable strategy as far as leveling up your additions, because the less damage you do, the more attacks you get, and the fewer battles you need to upgrade your additions. Fair enough. I have heard it said that if given the opportunity, players will optimize the fun out of a game, and personally, I'm not down with that. I will always prioritize my enjoyment over optimization or speed. It may be fun to see your character's victory poses every time the battle ends, but I'm not here for that. I'm here for the moment-to-moment experience. That's why anytime a speedrunner wants to take an authoritative stance and try to sell an objective best way to play a game, I tell them to eat a dick. Because I'm not here to play games your way, I'm here to play games my way. So basically, take your Bouncer Benjamin bullshit and shove it where the sun don't shine. My only issue with the counter-attacking is I wish I had one of my own. I can't necessarily say how that would work, but if they can interrupt my attacks, I want to interrupt theirs. I think maybe if you use the defense command and get attacked, there should be some sort of timed button press to be able to counter, because obviously it would be a bit too overpowered if you were able to counterattack at every opportunity, but if you're already defending, it makes sense to have. Now, I've actually heard that the addition system is somewhat divisive among traditional JRPG fans, because there are a lot of traditional fans that prefer a relaxed, non-intrusive gameplay system, such as a menu-based interface that puts the spectacle above any sort of level of gameplay. And you know what? To quote Jim Cornette, for the people who like that sort of thing, that's the sort of thing those people like. I respect people with different tastes, but if there's one thing I don't like, it's the people who I've seen call for the removal of the addition system if this game ever gets remade. Personally, that's where I draw the line as far as being tolerant. If you want traditional turn-based gameplay, there are dozens of games you can play, but this is basically the one game like this. So I disagree that your enjoyment should supersede my enjoyment when your hypothetical enjoyment of the game would fundamentally change the thing that makes it special. I don't mean to gatekeep, but if you don't like it, then just don't play it. Let me have my fun. If your fun means ruining my fun, go have fun elsewhere, especially if you can have fun elsewhere, unlike me, who's not a fan of other games of the genre, but I'm not asking for them to change. I mean, there are items you can get which will make the additions happen automatically, but to me, I just don't see the point in that these days, because you're essentially cheating yourself out of gameplay by doing that. So why would you spend $10,000 a piece on those items? But if you're wondering about the magical items that I mentioned a minute ago, there are two separate types. First of all, you have the multi-types. In this case, you need to aggressively mash the X button to get the attack to do more damage. I pretty much mastered a system of tapping the button with my index finger, which means I get over 200% almost every time. But then you have the magic attacks that have a fixed amount of damage, and these are accompanied by an impressive but nonetheless overlong animation. These I'm not so fond of, because it basically just pushes the combat into the realms of every other JRPG. As I've already discussed, I'm trying to avoid that in my case. And even then, even with the other magic items, I try to limit my usage of them to emergencies because they do get in the way of leveling up additions. The same kind of applies to the Dragoon forms. The Dragoon form is the unique selling point of the game. I mean, of course it is, the game's named after it. Basically, depending on whether or not your specific character has gotten their Dragoon spirit in the story, you can activate said form. How do you do this? Well, for every successful attack you do, you gain spirit points, or SP. And you need to have at least 100 SP to be able to activate your Dragoon form, though depending on how high your Dragoon level is, you can get upwards of 500 SP, which will give you 5 turns in the Dragoon form. In Dragoon form, your attack and defense are boosted, and you're given completely unique attacks. First of all is the Dragoon Edition, which is completely distinct from the normal editions, but are just as much of an accomplishment to pull off. Essentially, what happens is, this indicator will spin in a circle, and when it aligns with this other point in the circle, you press X. At that point, it'll count for an attack in your Dragoon Edition. As it goes on, it gets quicker and harder to time. Matter of fact, even after all these years, I've never been able to master these Dragoon editions. It's usually a crapshoot if I'm gonna get all 5. But if you feel like cheating a bit, Kongol's Dragoon edition only has 4 attacks. Either way, it's another thing I enjoy doing, unlike the Dragoon magic attacks, which I dislike for the exact same reason I dislike the non-button mashy magic items. Spectacular as they are, I'm sitting back and waiting for them to end. The same goes for the Dragoon transformation sequences. As spectacular as they are, they're really only worth seeing once. Then you might as well just go into the config menu and turn on the shortened version of the transformations. Incidentally, I remember hearing about how there's an entire genre of anime defined by this sort of thing. I don't remember what it was called, but that might be one of those tropes that people are so fond of talking about. I could probably find out the specific name if I could hold my nose and go on TV tropes, but I'm of the mind that TV tropes is a pseudo-intellectual circle jerk for people who aren't smart enough to come up with their own opinions. Man, I'm just grinding all the axes today. So the Dragoons are a good Hail Mary for any hard battle, but it's also theoretically when you're at your weakest, because you can't use items in Dragoon form. So if you happen to have a combination of characters without a healing ability, you have to hope to make it out of your Dragoon form without dying, and if one person dies, you have no way to revive them until someone is back to normal. Which can really screw you if all 3 of you die, so unless you're using a white mage, this is when you're at your most vulnerable. Though if you really want to stick it to whatever enemy you're fighting, you can use the special ability, which will automatically transform all 3 of your party members into their Dragoon form, and as a matter of fact, this will also give you an elemental buff to the element attributed to the person who activated the special. Yeah, this game has an elemental system wherein every character and every enemy has an element, and therefore an elemental weakness. Fire and ice, wind and earth, light and dark. The only elements without a weakness is thunder and non-elemental, which means Haschel, being the resident thunder god of your group, has an advantage of having no elemental weakness. Though he also has no elemental strengths, but yeah, you can strategically use this elemental buff to really lay into certain enemies. For example, Linus, which rhymes with, well, she's a major stumbling block in this game. She's one of the final bosses that usually takes unprepared players off guard, mostly because she has incredible speed and can have upwards of 5 attacks in a row before you have 1. But if you have Dart use his special, her elemental attacks do half damage, and that's a big help. Overall, the Dragoon forms are a fun aspect to the game, and I do love using them, but of course, because I'm steadfast as a mountain, I usually don't use them as much as I need to because of my playstyle. I'm stubborn like that. The only other ability in combat is the aforementioned Guard, which will restore 10% of your health, cuts damage done to you in half until the next turn, and also prevents you from getting status ailments. It may seem inconsequential, but this is important at times, especially because it's a passive combat ability that essentially allows you to put characters completely on the back burner if you want to. This is especially useful early on, before the characters you prefer to use are in your party, and you don't necessarily want to give any attention to a character that you may or may not be using long term. If you're like me and have played the game enough to know exactly which characters you want to pick from playthrough to playthrough, making them defend to prevent unnecessary progress, or if you're serious, even keeping them at deliberately low health so they can die pretty much every battle and not get any unnecessary XP so the rest of the XP can be divvied up among the characters you actually want to use, can potentially be dangerous because it leaves you open to potentially getting a game over, and even then it causes most battles to go on for about 3 times as long as it needs to, so it's really only if you're dedicated like me. Suboptimal play for optimal distribution of EXP is only for the sickos, and this has the unsaid benefit of hilarious moments where downed characters spring back to life to finish the battle. But as far as putting characters on the back burner, it's only useful for someone like me who's played the game enough times that I've pretty much used every single combination of characters, to the point where I can pretty much exactly pinpoint my preferred characters to use for my playstyle, which would be Dart, Albert, and Haschel. Why? Because, like I said, I prefer to deal physical attack more than I prefer to deal with magical attacks. And generally speaking, Haschel and Albert are the characters with the highest physical attack that also aren't slow as hell. Matter of fact, I've been umming and erring about making a Legend of Dragoon beginner's guide video for years, pretty much since this channel started. But my interest in the video was always weighed down by the fact that I was convinced nobody would care. But as far as this character roster is concerned, here's the gist. Dart's stats are incredibly balanced. His defense is a little low, but only by a factor of maybe 10% compared to what is ideal for a purely balanced character. Shauna and Miranda's physical stats are terrible, so they have low health, low physical attack, and defense, but supreme magical attack and defense, to the point where some people have been known to one-shot most bosses using them. But you have to be very careful due to the weaknesses, but if that's your playstyle, you're in the money. But it's also worth mentioning that the bow users don't have additions. However, they do have a base level accuracy of 120%, which makes them ideal for money grinding. There's no reason they couldn't have additions, like I'm just imagining a combo where they do a kick backflip off an enemy, fire an arrow midair, and then fire another arrow as soon as they land. And that's just off the top of my head. Make them act like Legolas. It's a lot more interesting than having no combos whatsoever. Meanwhile, Lavitz and Albert are basically the opposite. Their magical attack isn't great, and their magical defense is abysmal, meaning they're the opposite of ideal for magic-based boss fights, especially the secret boss. Plus, they're slow, with only 10 base attack speed above the slowest character in the game, meaning they don't get to attack as often. But with that said, their physical attack is through the roof. These two characters who occupy the same space are guaranteed to be the first characters that give you an 1000+ attack. Plus there's the Rose/Blossom Storm ability that is paramount for some of those more difficult boss fights, as it cuts all damage to everyone in half for 3 turns. You want to be using that as much as you can. Rose is a complicated character. She has pretty strong stats across the board at first. However, as she levels up, her stats fall behind the stats of other characters, so that by the end of the game she goes from overpowered to slightly underpowered. Haschel is another character like Lavitz and Albert, whose primary strength is his physical attack, with his biggest weakness being his magical defense. But his stats are much more balanced than the other two characters, and he also has really good speed, which is why I like to pair him up with the Lance users, because they're both physical attack specialists who balance out as far as speed is concerned. Plus, he doesn't have an elemental weakness, as I said. Miru has all the same weaknesses as the bow user and also has the lowest health overall. With that said, she's fast. Like, stupid fast. There are instances where the amount of turns she'll get compared to the other characters in your team will be 3 to 1. So if the lance users are glass cannons, Miru is a glass ice pick, which might match your style, and that's not to say that she's unusable. I've beaten the game with her. In fact, I've beaten the game with every character, including the final of the crew, Kongal, the resident Giganto and boss fight turned ally, and like other boss fights turned ally, he's not as interesting once he's an ally, nor is he as powerful. But there was some novelty to this idea growing up. Kongal has by far the best physical attack out of everyone, just an absolute beefcake. With that said, however, his stats pretty much suffer in every other way, up to and including having the worst speed in the game. So if you don't go out of your way to give him an item that will raise his speed stat, he's basically useless. Plus, he only has 3 additions, he doesn't show up until about halfway through the game, and you have to go out of your way to find his Dragoon spirit, which is in the commercial town of Lohan in the first disc, and it costs you 1,000 smackers. So basically, he's a really inconvenient character to use, especially if you're having to wait for him and use other characters in the meantime. That's the summary of all the different characters, and you can plan your specific playstyle accordingly. It's funny, every one of these characters accounts for a specific element, but there's no character specific to the non-elemental element. Yeah, they actually say in the tutorial that non-elemental is itself an element, which is paradoxical. That's like calling atheism a religion. But given that there are some extra spaces on the character menu, you could have theoretically had an 8th player. Let me know in the comment section who you think should have been a hypothetical 8th playable character. There are a few, Master Tasman for example. He trained Dart and defended Celeste, but decided to go on his own journey immediately after the game's prologue. No reason he couldn't have stuck around, he seemed like he should have been more important. Lloyd is of course an obvious choice to have had as a playable character, but unless you rearrange the story, that wouldn't hypothetically be available until the end of the 3rd disc, and at that point the game's almost over. So there would be no point in basing your playstyle around him if you barely get to play as him. Drake the Bandit survived. He could have stuck around, used throwable items and non-elemental attacks. He could have very well been a comedic foil for the rest of the crew. I'm blanking on anyone else, but I'm sure there's somebody I'm forgetting. Of course, no matter how many characters you have, the strategy is slightly limited for one big reason. For reasons I don't understand, Dart is forcefully put as a permanent member of the team. I don't mind the idea of someone being forced into being a member of the fighting crew for story purposes, because if you're gonna single someone out as a primary character for a specific moment, they should be treated as such in theory, because in a story-heavy genre like JRPGs, the audience wants the story to dictate the gameplay, not necessarily the other way around. There's like an entire chunk of the game where Dart loses his Dragoon spirit to a bandit named Mappy. Yes, that's actually his name. And yeah, if you're a player who wants to prioritize using their Dragoon more than they use other methods of attack, that might be a pisser from a gameplay standpoint, but it's acceptable because it's a major plot development and drives a significant chunk of story in Chapter 2. It's a necessary happenstance, but Dart as a character doesn't necessarily have any story reason for being in the battle at all times, whether you like it or not, other than the fact that he's the designated main character, something that many other JRPGs don't enforce. Him being forced into the main cast of fighters at all times has 2 major issues. First of all, it limits the amount of combinations of characters you can do. Dart may be a well-rounded character, but maybe his stats aren't optimal for the type of build you want to do. In theory, I think my personal ideal team would be Haschel, Albert, and Miru. That way you get a bit of everything, but it's literally impossible to have that combination without hacking the game. And the second major issue with forcing Dart into battle at all times is his weakness. You're at a theoretical disadvantage if you're fighting either fire or water type enemies, and since you can't swap him out of the party, this is a weakness that you just have to deal with for the entire game. Whereas in any sane world, you would want players to have full control over their strategy and have the ability to swap characters in and out to optimize for certain situations. I mean, thankfully, if you really feel like it, you can use cheats and patches in an emulator, and if you also feel like it, using an emulator you can more easily play the Japanese version of the game that way. And the Japanese version is notably much harder than the North American version, although then you'd be losing out on the story, and personally that's where I draw the line. But yeah, there are solutions if you really feel like it, but for the base game, they deliberately limit your strategy for no reason. That's pretty much everything you need to know about the battle system in this game, and everything I love about it. Does the gameplay offer anything outside of the battles? Well, not much, but then again, it doesn't really need to. Of course, there are various safe towns for you to visit, and what I uniquely like about this game in particular, it understands the benefits of pacing. In any sort of RPG, J or A, there will always be a lot of story, and you need to dump the story on the player in significant bursts. But you also don't want to do that unless the player is engaged. For example, that's why whenever I talk about Final Fantasy IX, I have to talk about how much I love it. Story. But I can't stand actually playing the game all the way through anymore because I can't stand how slow-paced that game is these days. And that's because I did try and play it a couple of years back, and as much as I enjoyed the world and the characters, in the first 5 hours there was maybe like 20 minutes worth of gameplay. It was endless barrages of exposition and story. And it's a good story, but the pacing was terrible for someone like me who needs to be properly immersed before you have a dump on me that size. That came out wrong. Meanwhile, with The Legend of Dragoon, they make sure to have a balance of story sequences and gameplay sequences, so neither ever overtakes the experience, but rather they complement each other. You're never doing pure gameplay for so long that it becomes tedious, but you're never in a story sequence for so long that you get antsy and want to get back to gameplay. I mean, sure, there are times where the story segments are going a bit slow, and there are also times when I feel I get into random encounters a bit often, but it's very rarely something I think about. Oh, and for the record, I have been given shit in the past for calling the battles in this game random encounters, but they are random encounters. Just because the game tells you how close you are to getting into an encounter, that doesn't make it not random. If it's an enemy encounter that's not specifically programmed to take place in a specific spot, it's a random encounter. Anyways, it's also a game that starts lightning quick as well. You start the game and you're immediately bombarded with several intrigues while a town is getting ransacked. Then you meet the main character who runs into a couple of soldiers who intend to attack him, only to be attacked by a dragon and is saved by a mysterious warrior. More and more intrigues stacked on top of each other. Then he finds out that it was his town that he was returning to after 5 years that was getting ransacked, and he runs in to save what's left. It's something like a 5-minute sequence, but it establishes so much so succinctly. Then from that moment, it's pretty much non-stop gameplay for a couple hours mixed with character-building dialogues. It doesn't waste your time and gets straight into the action. And only once you get to the other side of the country and meet up with King Albert in Bale do they take their time to slow things down and give you some quiet story moments now that you're properly engaged. It's a JRPG for the impatient, seemingly both in gameplay and story progression. The story's fast-paced, and the gameplay takes traditional JRPG-style combat and makes you smash buttons. I guess that's what I like about it. I mean, I just said that completely spur of the moment, but it actually makes sense to me about why I like this game compared to any other JRPG I've played. It doesn't just assume you're on board with all the genre's idiosyncrasies, it earns your interest. It's a JRPG for the impatient. Okay, well there is one instance at the beginning of the third disc which has an extended story sequence that gets a bit tiresome, but that's all well and good. But yeah, these safe towns you come across are a nice serene breather to help you catch your breath. And even then, these safe cities do have their own activities to occupy you while you're in between exposition dumps. And no, I'm not talking about those asinine minigames. Every single minigame in this game is about as entertaining as a sock to the jaw. The only time I ever tolerate them is during a period in the story where you're on a date with Shauna at the carnival, and I just, don't want to disappoint her. But thankfully, none of it is strictly mandatory, nor am I talking about the occasional forced stealth section, most notably in the second chapter where you have to sneak around the imposter guards, and for what it's worth, the forced stealth in this game is about as appealing as a porcupine on your nutsack. No, what I'm talking about is the Stardust. This is the main exploration element that the game gives you. In most save towns, you can find multiple Stardust pieces, and you can trade them to this character named Martel, who I thought was a dude for the longest time. For every 10, you get an ultra rare item, so it's worth it just to go out of your way to find them. Admittedly, they do become rarer as the game goes on, as I suspect the game became a little bit more rushed. And as such, the best instances of this are early in the game, and in particular Bale. Like when you have to do a multi-part puzzle just to get access to a boat so you can sail in this underground cellar to find a piece of Stardust. A puzzle that includes giving a homeless bum booze. Yay enabling. So that's funny, but yeah, by the end of the game, they kind of lose faith in the concept, but it's still worth it to collect them for 2 reasons. First of all, Martel, the person collecting them, has a sick child and she needs the Stardust to wish her child back to health. And I feel like a bit of a dick if I don't go out of my way to at least get the child to a point of relative health. And second of all, collecting Stardust gives you access to the super ultra hard secret final boss that all these games have. A boss called Magician Faust. I'm not even kidding when I say if you don't have the most powerful magical defensive items in the game, this guy will one-shot you, and even if you do, there's still a chance he might. Or he'll just wear you down with multiple attacks in a row because he has the highest speed stat of any enemy in the game. If you get to this point, he makes you earn it. That said, the item that gives you the best chance at him is called the Legend Cask, which raises your magic defense by ungodly amounts and also gives you a magic 50% dodge rate, which outside of this one boss fight pretty much makes you immune to magic attacks. The Armor of Legend does the same thing for physical attacks. Each of these items cost 10,000 apiece, and considering you only organically accrue roughly 20,000 gold throughout the entire game, you have to grind for these, and since I'm steadfast as a mountain, I end up doing this every single time. It does take away the challenge by the end, but I don't know, this is just the way I play. I tend to grind using the enemy called 00 Parts, some sort of anachronistic robot enemy that gives you 600 gold. And it's found right in this area near the Black Castle. Fighting it can be a bit of a pain in the ass. Ideally, you want Miru and one of the bow users both with accuracy upgrades. You want to use the Magic Stone of Signet, or the Magic Sig Stone, found in the marshes, which will freeze it in place for 3 turns. Then you want to use the speed up power found in the Valley of Corrupted Gravity. And then pray to whatever god you may or may not believe in that you have enough time to finish the fight. Because if you don't, Buddy Boy ends the fight by killing one member of your party and running away. Still, I put up with it for this enemy because you only have to kill them 100 times, unlike the much easier Yellow Bird, which only gives you 300 gold. Usually takes a while, a couple hours at least, but like I said, it's just what I do. You can also grind for XP if you really feel like it, but your specific level isn't as important as your stats and equipment. Other than overall health, there's not much to differentiate each level. You only really start to notice a difference every 5 or so levels. The easiest way I found to do this would be in the space between the Valley of Corrupted Gravity and the home of the Gigantos, where you encounter this enemy called the Bluebird, which will also run away after a while, but it doesn't kill you in the process. Killing it will give you 1000 XP. Grind in this area for an hour and you'll probably get 4 or 5 levels apiece. With that said, however, there is an enemy called the Rainbow Bird which gives you 3000 XP, but the biggest issue with this one, it can only be hurt by using an item that causes confusion, and let's be frank here, the chances of actually killing a Rainbow Bird using something as inconsistent as confusion without it running away is probably a 1 in 100 chance. Plus, these things only show up at the end of the game, so by that point, you're probably all leveled up. Either way, you're not killing them. That is unless you do what I do and save your sachets. This is an item you get early on in the game, and it's a guaranteed 10 damage no matter what. It's used very early on to put this boss Giongo to sleep, which is useful because the boss is a pretty significant stumbling block for new players. But if you save them, you can get 3 easy kills against the Rainbow Bird for a free 9000 XP. Why? Because all unique enemies like this have only like 4 or 5 health and you can do only 1 damage per turn. So if you save your sachets, easy XP. Though it's divided among your party, so it's more like 3000 apiece, so if you're wondering why the sachets are so valuable to sell, that's why. It's a guaranteed legendary kill. There's only one area where you have a random chance to pick them off enemies. It's like a 1% drop in the home of the Gigantos. So unless you literally have nothing but time, you're only gonna naturally accrue 3 in the entire game. The biggest drawback of having to save 3 sachets as well as the speed up, the magic sig stone, and whatever other rare items you may pick up is that it takes up a significant chunk of your inventory, which only has 32 slots. I understand the idea is you don't want to have players too overloaded because the lowest level of healing item in this game fills half a health bar, but I feel like it should have been at least 40. 32 is too low. You have to ration your item slots like the British rationing their food in World War II. You have space for maybe 5 healing items, 4 revives. You shouldn't waste your time with items that give you SP or MP, because you should theoretically be getting SP really quickly and MP can be restored at towns. And unless you're using them for every battle, you don't need an exceptional amount. When it comes to attack items, you should maybe carry 5 or 6 at a time. You should maybe carry 2 mind purifiers and body purifiers at any given time. And that only gets more complicated as petrification gets introduced, and that requires a whole different item. Thankfully, there's only a small handful of areas where petrification is an issue. The most useless item in the game that you want to get rid of the moment you have them are the items that give enemies status ailments, like poison or confusion, because most regular enemies die too quickly to make it worth it, and none of the bosses are affected by them. So why would you waste your time with that outside of highly contextual circumstances when your item number is already as low as it is? You're just wasting space. Overall, I think it's too restrictive and could have used a bit of easing up. I mean, there are hacks that let you set the inventory space to 99, but that's a bit too much. That's too forgiving. I feel like if this game were to be remade, I would hope for something a little bit more in the middle. I mean, the armor and accessory slots are basically unlimited, but I don't even think there are enough selections of those items to fill up the entire list. This is actually one of the lesser aspects of the game in my opinion. To be fair, there's a good amount of accessories you can get, these items with the ring icon, and there are plenty of ways to mix and match these for optimizing a particular playthrough. Emphasizing certain types of defense, certain types of attack, speed, accuracy, giving you MP or SP every time you're attacked in a certain way, etc. But as far as other equipment, armor, and weapons, there really isn't enough. Every character has a small handful of each of these items, and they don't really run a large gamut as far as different status effects, buffs, or whatever. There was potential to functionally replace the useless items that give status ailments with weapons that give status ailments, like maybe having a weapon with base stats, but then you can have some sort of secondary item that you can combine with your weapon to give it a chance at an extra effect a la modern God of War. Then you could implement fear or knockout or confusion or whatever the case may be without taking up inventory space. And that way you can use the different status elements to combine with your particular playstyle. Unfortunately, what they instead did was give each party member a very small variety of equipment that they might find throughout the game, and there are a few different pieces of equipment that each character will get that includes some sort of status effect. Like Rose has a sword that will induce fear, Haschel has a gauntlet that will induce knockout, etc. But the specific status ailments that each character gets is so random and so few and far between that it's not even worth remarking on, and it's ultimately meaningless because regardless of what extra added effect a weapon or item may have, you're going to be picking the weapons with the most defense. It's only logical. The only exception you get would be the sword from the Polter armor called the Soul Eater. It's the most powerful sword for Dart, but it drains his life as he uses it. Unless you happen to also have a therapy ring to cancel it out, and that just says it all, doesn't it? There isn't much strategy to be had from specific item combinations. The selection is so small it basically comes down to picking whatever is the predestined most logical weapon combination every single time. And I feel like there was an opportunity for a much grander item system that was left on the table. But all that could have been solved if they just gave you more weapons and armor per character instead of the small handful that we got. But even then, that wouldn't make the status ailments items less useless. Speaking of the Polter armor, that boss fight is one of a small handful of optional bosses. This game isn't as grand in scope as a lot of other games of its type. It's mostly linear, which helps make the story feel more focused, but it also makes the world feel a little less grand. But they do put a lot of effort into making the world feel lived in despite the rampant linearity. I mean, yeah, there are a lot of NPCs that you can interact with that each have something unique to say, but that's pretty standard. But there's an extra layer of detail here that I really appreciate. Now, when it comes to what I'm about to say, keep in mind I'm not a connoisseur of JRPGs, I don't know how common a lot of these things are, but I also really enjoy coming back to these environments after the story in those areas have concluded, because you can usually see the aftermath of your actions, talk to people about great battles, or just about how things have improved since the conflicts have been resolved. One of my favorite details is if you go back to the house of Ms. Slambert after Disc 1, you'll find a family living in that house, because they were refugees that Lavitz promised a place to stay. Can't say much more than that without spoiling a major plot development, but it's a very bittersweet moment. Or when you go back to Kazas after defeating Dole at the end of Disc 1, you'll find a character named Popo who had previously helped you break into the Black Castle talking about rebuilding efforts. Though I think my favorite one in the entire game is completely incidental to the story. There's this vacant shack very early into the game where you duck the Imperial Guard and treat Lavitz's wounds. But if you go back there after Disc 1, you'll find this guy who lives there, and also he has an almost fetishistic appreciation for chopping wood. So much detail that would be very easy to miss if you don't know about it. It's all in an effort to make the world feel more ever-evolving, and yet it's still one of those things you probably wouldn't even notice unless you're a psychotic obsessive like me. With that said, as far as the aforementioned optional bosses, let's see if I can remember them off the top of my head. You have the aforementioned Polter Armor in Gloriano, the place where the Dragon campaign was declared. Then you have Magician Faust. You have the Scarred Virage in the Forbidden Lands. You have the, I think, 4 restless spirits of the previous generation of Dragoon warriors in Velweb. You have the 3 Dragon Souls in Mayfill, which is basically just repeated boss fights from earlier in the game. I think that's all of them. Oh right, I almost forgot about Kamui the Wolf, although if you didn't know that boss was optional, I would not blame you, but yes, you can totally just go straight to Leningrad. Oh yeah, there's also that general in the marshlands in the first disc, where you can take part of an optional battle, but I'm not sure if he counts as a boss fight or just a slightly elevated regular enemy. Most of these optional bosses are right in your path and are pretty hard to miss, but a few of them require you going off the beaten path, like how the Polter Armor can only be found if you happen to fall down this ridge. Incidentally, I've played this game like 10 times and I still can't figure out how to stop yourself on these hills to grab these items. Oh, there you go. But otherwise, they don't put in that much effort, but that's fine, I still go out of my way to fight them every time, if only just as an excuse to get a bit more gameplay. And besides, I prefer secret bosses not be too out of the way, cause I don't want to waste my time hunting them down. The worst of it is probably the 4 restless spirits in Velweb, because this is an area at the end of Disc 3, but you can't do these bosses until at least the beginning of Disc 4, so you need to come back. However, Velweb is in the very corner of the world. Literally top left corner. But even by the time you unlock fast travel at the beginning of Disc 4 to make things a bit easier if you need to backtrack, the closest you can travel is to Leningrad, which is like 3 entire areas away, so it's a real hassle to get back to that area. As for the normal boss fights themselves, there's too many to go over individually, but some of the highlights include the Shirley boss fight, which is a subversive boss fight built around not attacking her, though you can, and it's an easy way to addition grind if you want. Kongol Part 1 and 2 are pretty good because he's one of the few bosses with a proper counterattack, and he will do so if at any point you fail your additions. All the dragon boss fights are pretty memorable because they usually come pre-packaged with some pretty serious firepower, pretty unique attacks, and honestly just kinda look cool. The Grand Jewel is pretty interesting. It has a gimmick of being able to depower your Dragoon attacks, forcing you to fight it physically, and it also has the ability to turn back time on you, de-leveling you. There's several boss fights with these creatures named Virages, which will become more relevant as the story discussion happens, and every time you fight one, it escalates more and more. First, it's a weak Virage that's barely clinging to life, then it's a fully grown soldier Virage. Later on into the game, you fight a more elevated version of the Virage, but it's considered scarred and weak, and with that one, it also has a self-destruct timer, which is pretty cool. And finally, one of the final boss fights in the entire game is the same elevated Virage, but it's full strength. And then an underrated boss fight would probably be the Wendigo, because it only has a couple of health points, you just need to be able to attack its heart, which can only be done at certain contextual points. This is not to say the rest of the bosses aren't memorable, they each have their strengths, weaknesses, and unique attacks, but many of them are fought in the same way, and as such, it would be redundant to go over all of them. Though I probably should talk about the stumbling block bosses since I've mentioned them several times. The stumbling block bosses, as you can tell by the qualifier, is a series of sudden spikes in difficulty which will catch you off and will likely cause you to not continue for a couple of tries. The first one is probably Fairbrand and Graham, that turncoat who killed Lavitz's father. It's the first boss fight with 2 equally powerful enemies and they can rip you up, and Fairbrand's poison attacks don't help. The second one is pretty soon after, which is the Drake the Bandit fight, because he has these bomb attacks that can take a few turns to get to you, but if you don't deal with them, they're devastating. Plus, he can heal and put up webs that can make him immune to damage. He's a pain in the ass. The next one would be Giongo, because they balance this one by having you put it to sleep, and when it's not asleep, it can have multiple attacks in a row, and this falling stalactite attack is devastating. Emperor Dole, the final boss of the first disc, is the next one, and he has 3 separate attacks that can do serious damage to all 3 of your party members, and even then, he has a stage where he has a protective barrier around him, so you have to hope to survive until it disappears. That's a tough one, and I would say Linus is the final stumbling block boss, as she has insane speed. Once you get past Linus, I don't think there's another boss in the game that poses a major threat, because by that point, if you're any good, your stats and equipment should have surpassed the average boss fight enough that you can get through pretty much all of them. It's funny, I can pretty much zip through this entire game without much difficulty anymore, so I kind of take for granted that I used to struggle with this game, and I take for granted that other people may struggle. So keep in mind, when you get to these bosses, you may need to put some extra work in beforehand. And I must say, for all the different bosses, they all have a very distinct visual design as well, which is impressive. I can pretty much identify all these bosses off their silhouettes alone. And then there are the standard enemies, of which there are over 100, and while some of them are recolors of other enemies, and some of them are just straight up weird, like the ugly balloon, there are a lot of them that are visually distinct and quite interesting design-wise. Though I want to single this one out in particular because I have a question, like a serious question. Doesn't this look exactly like an alien from the original Ben 10 series? I haven't watched it in like 20 years, but this design super rings a bell. But whoever translated this game was definitely having a laugh because some of these names are ridiculous. Like how you have a living tree called Trent. I mean, I could do a montage of all the weirdest names in the game. So I will. But there is one that I want to put a particular spotlight on because it's too ridiculous to not single out. There is an enemy in this game called the Erupting Chick. I'm gonna pause for a few seconds to let that sink in. The obvious quip to make at this point is, I've had a few erupting chicks in my time, but I'd like to think I'm better than that. But then again, the names of the regular characters or even locations aren't much better. This led to a lot of pronunciation issues over the years. Even Dragoon is a bit of a weird one if you think about it. Back in the day, people used to pronounce it with a soft A all the time. Thankfully, that's not really a thing anymore. Now, a dragoon is a real-world thing. Matter of fact, it has multiple definitions, most commonly referred to as a particular branch of the British Cavalry Regiment. It may also be just a general-use term for cavalry of that same type outside of the British Army as well, but that's not my area of expertise. And according to Google, it's also an uncommon phrase referring to coercing someone into doing something. I'm assuming it's because of the prefix drag. Now, as far as I'm aware, the real-world version of Dragoon is pronounced Dragoon. However, it's worth mentioning that since this is a fictional name, it may be pronounced differently. However, there are FMV cutscenes with voice acting in them, and they do say Dragoon multiple times.
The anger and sadness of the people was fuel for the Dragoon's cause.
So I'm pronouncing it the way the game pronounces it. Same with Shauna.
Shauna!
Like, yeah, technically that spelling can also be Shanna, but it's like Asuka in GTA 3. In real life, it should be pronounced Asuka, but then if the game pronounces it a different way, then within universe, that's the correct pronunciation. And to be clear, there are a lot of weird things in this game that nobody can really agree on the pronunciation of. Like, it's generally agreed this character's name is pronounced Miru, but what is it about that spelling that makes it definitively a long E instead of a short E? With that said, the pronunciation of this guy's name has been a thorn in my ass for most of my life. I spent most of my life pronouncing it Levitz, and apparently that's incorrect, but a bunch of people have claimed different pronunciations exist. I've heard Lavitz, Levitz. Nobody can agree. I think the general consensus is Lavitz, and my Google speech-to-text function agrees because Lavitz is the pronunciation that it recognizes. But trust me when I say, it was no easy task trying to decipher some of the names in this game. Okay, I really got off topic there. So let's circle back to something from earlier, because I want to take the opportunity to discuss the safe towns in this game a bit more. And in particular, circle around to the presentation of this game, because I feel the safe towns are really where you get a sense for just how absolutely stunningly gorgeous this game is for its time. In the overworld, while the characters are generally simple polygon arrangements that probably would have blended into the game better on a CRT television, and actually can sometimes clash wildly in the interaction with the backgrounds, like what the hell is this? Also this moment where Dart just kind of collapses briefly. But the environments are pre-rendered and hand-animated, and f*** me raw. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say these are some of the most stunningly beautiful backgrounds in the history of the original PlayStation. It's another one of those cases where if society collapsed, I would love to settle down in a place like this. Or this. Or this. Just absolutely stunning, especially any areas with water in them. Like this. Or this. Or this. You have these stunning cityscapes, vibrant hostile areas that have no right to look as good as they do, and even the desolate environments have a certain dilapidated charm to them. My god, what I wouldn't give to have a remake so I could see all these environments fully realized. You can tell by the time this game came out, the developers had really gotten their heads around the hardware and were really able to push it to its absolute limit. Admittedly, playing this on a modern setup with sharp pixels probably doesn't do it proper justice. Though the character designs are really good and very distinctive, all the main characters are ostensibly color-coded based on their element. I remember reading some terrible review of the game on GameSpot that was so atrocious it actually called Shauna Shenna. This review compared the color coding to Power Rangers, and I disagree with that. I feel like it's subtle enough that you might not even pay any mind to it, especially because some of the colors are more subtle and earth tone. Even still, good character designs, recognizable at a distance. There is definitely some surreality to this game world in a lot of ways. Odd architecture, quirky outfits, weird means of getting around. But I've said in the past that one of the reasons I like the PS1 era so much is that because of the crude graphics, it creates an inbuilt surreality that almost gives these games an art style in themselves, and I feel like the quirkiness of the game world built into that, along with the general quirky video gaminess in general. Like, it's one of those things I completely take for granted at this point, but it's kind of hilarious that characters will just walk in and out of Dart every time they need to have some sort of dialogue. Even Kongal, who's like 8 times his size. I understand it's about hardware limitation and the fact they couldn't render 7 different character models on screen at full speed. I kind of miss when games could just be unassumingly quirky like this. As much as I do like games in the modern sense, you'll never catch a character in Far Cry, for example, merging into the main character whenever they need to disappear. Games have a tendency of being a bit too self-serious these days, and I do appreciate that, but I wish there was more space for unintentional jank. Once you get into the battle, the game doesn't look quite as good because in that case it's all polygonal graphics as opposed to pre-rendered backgrounds, though it's impressive just how many unique backgrounds they have in this game, sometimes having multiple per environment, sometimes having ones that only show up once. Same with the in-engine cutscenes, and those ones are probably the worst looking in the game, not because they look different from the in-game graphics, more so because the frame rate is really weirdly inconsistent in these cutscenes. Sometimes you have really strangely high FPS animations alongside rather low FPS animations. I will say though, that's probably made up for by the fully CGI cutscenes. It's funny because when you think PS1 era CGI cutscenes, you generally don't think of anything particularly good because of the technology of the era mixed with the general low budget of games at the time. Feel free to prove me wrong in this case, but The Legend of Dragoon has some of the most stunningly gorgeous and really weirdly advanced CGI cutscenes for pretty much anything at the time, let alone games. In fairness, that's probably why the game comes on 4 discs. It doesn't come across to me like a game that's 4 discs big, but even if these things are only once in a while, they are a treat to see, although the voice acting is categorically ass.
Is this really necessary?
It is His Majesty, Emperor Dole's command, to take that girl into custody.
Who is she?
That is not your concern.
Every character is either chewing the scenery or conveying the emotion of a fast food order. There is no in between. It kind of makes it equal parts awesome and terrible, which I guess only contributes to the appeal of these cutscenes and what makes them special.
The divine tree is the tree of life. All life comes from this divine tree.
My favorite one is obviously the Divine Dragon attack in the 3rd disc because my god, that was impressive. Though a very close second would be the cutscene depicting the end of the Dragon campaign. Though it's worth mentioning that the environments in the cutscenes are often far more grand than the actual environments in the game, especially by the time you get to Leningrad, because once again it kinda seemed like they were maybe running the project with a little less enthusiasm than they were at the beginning of the game, and as such the areas within a lot of these environments seem to be a bit truncated compared to what they were in the 1st disc, and especially what they were in the cutscenes. So that's another thing that really makes me yearn for a remake, because I would really like to see more of what this city has to offer. I wouldn't expect them to model the entire city flat out. Obviously, that's a waste of time and resources if you're not going to do anything with a lot of it. But I would like to see it kind of like Rabanastre from Final Fantasy XII. Not a full city, but plenty of room to look around and have fun. If they could translate the visual appeal of these environments into a modern setting, I don't think I'm kidding when I say I would kill for that sort of thing. I mean, I've killed for less. Then you combine the visual presentation with the absolutely stupendous musical composition, and you have a combination like no other. I don't own a lot of physical video game soundtracks on CD. I think the only soundtracks I have were coupled with special editions of games I bought. I think I only have like 2 or 3 of those, but there's one video game soundtrack I've actually gone out of my way to buy, and it's this one. I'm not even usually one to discuss soundtracks in video games because I'm not that musically literate, but I'll make an exception here. Where do I even start? Well, the main theme is probably a good place to start. The vocal theme, if you still believe. Sung by the incredible Elsa Raven, one of my favorite vocal themes in gaming. The lyrics are a bit cheesy, but it's a song based around lamenting losing someone you care about and believing that one day you'll find them again, which is somewhat of a recurring theme in this game, with multiple people spending a significant chunk of their life searching or waiting for the ones they've lost. Some of which are reunited, some of which are not. It's a beautiful song, well composed. But like I said, the lyrics are cheesy, so your mileage may vary. Once in the game, one track that immediately springs to mind would be Dart's theme. This is a track that's meant to be inspirational and plays when the team decides on a course of action. It's the type of track that conveys running headlong into danger with speed and determination. That is workout playlist worthy. It's the quintessential get pumped up theme. And speaking of running headlong into danger, every single battle theme If ever you needed a reason to just pause in the middle of a battle, this is it. Objectively, the best one is probably the Forbidden Lands battle theme, even though it has some negative memory associations that kinda ruin it for me. If you know, you know. If you don't, good. These battle themes, aside from being fairly varied, are absolutely killer tracks, just hard-hitting, exciting, and really captures that battle atmosphere. Those guitar licks are sublime when they get into the peak of the song. Then we have Shauna's theme, and I like that it sounds like it's coming out of a child's music box, because innocence and purity are 2 of the central themes surrounding her character. She is the one uncorrupted soul in a world full of madness, which is a bit of an ironic statement, but let's not talk about that just yet. Either way, it's a fitting track, and it can only be described as kinda cute, you know? Then you get into the more emotionally resonant themes, such as Death and Mourning. There's no shortage of emotional scenes in this game, and when some of these tracks hit, it's hard not to get misty-eyed. I mean, the heavy piano does lay it on a bit thick in some of these tracks, but fittingly, I'd say. I can't exactly say why that's the case without spoiling some things, but it's a very fitting track for certain situations. God, the longer I go without being able to discuss the story, the more the dam that is my discussion of it cracks. Tortured metaphors aside, now we get into the area themes. There's a lot of recycling, obviously. Most area themes are recycled a handful of times for various locations, but that's just fine by me. You have 4 particular themes that stand out to me for their absolute serenity and beauty. Grassy plains, peace between hills, together in peace with you, and whispering of the trees. There's so much zen energy emanating from these tracks that it's practically able to pull you into a contented mindset in itself. The musical equivalent of a nice sunny day. Then of course you have the regality of both the royal capital and royal castle themes. I mean, it's a shame I already used the word regal because there's really no other word for it. I will admit the steel drums and the royal capital theme was certainly a choice. It's definitely more fitting in areas like Fletz, which is a tropical area, but still, just superb in their composition. Then of course, enough good cannot be said about the world map themes. My favorite is probably the second world map. That's just chill background noise. Then I love the Arabic instrumentation of the commercial town of Lohan. There's the mysterious heir to Shirley's shrine. The additionally upbeat energy of the Queen Fury theme. Or the strangely funky menu theme. The menu theme did not need to go that hard. Look, this is a very special soundtrack to me. It's one of those soundtracks where no matter how much I showcase and analyze it, there will always be other tracks. So I'm still leaving out some pretty significant heavy hitters, but every single one of these tracks are great. But there is one more which I could not leave this section without discussing. That is the Leningrad theme. I don't know what it is about this theme. The epic orchestration, the thick atmosphere, the jaw-dropping instrumentation. The first time I got to this area back when I played this game all the way through when I was 15, I just sat there for like 10 minutes straight listening to this song. It's almost cliched for me to say considering I've been saying it for a decade, but this is without a doubt my favorite song on the entire soundtrack. It's sublime. I also just noticed something. This is a city in a frozen tundra with a bunch of off-brand Cossacks, and it's called Leningrad? Just changed the D to an L. Long story slightly shorter, this is my favorite soundtrack in the history of gaming. This is one of those soundtracks where I'll just randomly use it as background noise when I'm working or just need noise to listen to. And these composers deserve their flowers, those being Dennis Martin and Takeo Muratsu. Dennis Martin is still around. I don't know what he's up to though, but Takeo Muratsu unfortunately is no longer with us. But at least he was able to make his mark on the world before leaving. Then when the visuals and soundtrack meet, it creates a particle collision of pure atmosphere. Some of these areas in the game have an atmosphere so thick you could cut it with a knife. Atmosphere really is one of those things that's hard to articulate. We all know what it is, but putting it into words is not exactly easy. I guess to put it simply, it's the way the overall presentation combines to create a mood. While each individual area invokes a different feeling compared to the last, I would say there's a lot of atmosphere here. The thing that immediately sticks out to me in my mind is the feeling of desolation in Velweb or Neat. You could practically feel the absolute nothingness surrounding you. No living beings around you, not a single bird to chirp. Absolute stillness with maybe a gentle breeze rustling through your hair as the only indication that you're still alive. And then you have places like Fletz or Bale or the flower city of Donau that have such a gentle, homey atmosphere where you can practically hear the kids playing in the street and the smell of fresh baked bread in the air. Like a place you've never been to but somehow still feels like you've lived there your whole life. Then you have the places like the Nest of the Dragon or the Shrine of Shirley, which each individually have such an oppressive mysteriousness to them, like you're not sure if you're gonna walk around a corner and suddenly get stabbed with a poison knife. The most common mood you'll encounter with this game is a general sense of unfolding mystery. Every hostile environment has a tension as the larger mysteries surrounding the areas unfold. But even then, some of the environments beyond the safe areas still feel quite cozy, especially in the more early areas. This game is just overall very good at making you feel, and maybe that's a bit unique to me because I know this game better than I know my own city I live in, and therefore everything about it is memorable to me, right down to the UI with all those little triangle indicators, or the beautifully made character portraits which I can practically recreate from memory at this point. I don't know, to me this game is just distinctly memorable in pretty much every way. Is that everything? Alright, I think that's everything. I believe that's everything I can talk about before getting into the story. So basically, if I've sold you on the game thus far, then this is your last chance to play the game relatively spoiler-free. If you have a PS4 or PS5 kicking around, it's available to buy digitally. If that's not an option, there are other means to obtain these games that I will not mention, but anybody with a slight bit of savvy will know what to do. This isn't the longest JRPG in the world. I can reliably beat it in about 40 hours or so. Meanwhile, the only other JRPG I've ever played all the way through legitimately would be Final Fantasy XII, which took me like 72 hours. That was back in high school when I had a lot more time on my hands. Still, 40 hours, maybe more if you're going for a completionist run. That's plenty of time to make a compelling plot, and while there's no doubt that there's a lot of ways you can poke holes into the plot, it's one of those cases where it's one of my favorite stories in the history of gaming. But I will acquiesce to the fact I don't know where the quality of writing ends and my affection for the game begins. This is one of those games that has a story so near and dear to me that it's pretty much impossible for me to view it in any sort of objective light. So if it feels like I'm glazing the story a bit, then well spotted, but I feel like this is my story to glaze because it's special to me. And also it's one of my favorite games of all time. I know I'm biased, but I am to be the way I am, and I refuse to try and be anything different. I've never been able to get into Final Fantasy VII, maybe you won't be able to get into this game. And this is the part that always catches me because I've had to rewrite this like 4 or 5 times. Where do I even begin? Well, I guess I have to begin at the beginning, because there's quite a lot of lore. So in the beginning, there was nothing. The world was a desolate wasteland until Soa created the Divine Tree. Who is Soa?
Basically God.
Which is funny because they actually do refer to him as just God in a lot of cases. He's actually not even referred to as Soa that often. With the Divine Tree came the Divine Fruit. From each of the 108 fruit came one of the species of the world, which is a bit odd because discounting the unique enemies that are human or presumably human, I counted like 119 unique monsters. With that said, there are some variations of monsters that are different breeds of the same species, undead, or are inanimate objects that are brought to life and wouldn't have been from the Divine Tree. I wanted to see for myself if the different species could possibly correlate to the different fruits, so I decided to make a spreadsheet. So does 108 check out? Yes, there are 75 unique species that you encounter as enemies, with 3 extra that may be a unique species or maybe a variation of another species. Then you have 2 other species that I'm not sure what they qualify as. One is a possible dragon and one is a possible automaton, for a total of somewhere between 75 and 80. Then you have humans, dragons, winglies, gigantos, menintos, and the 108th fruit, for a total of upwards of 86 unique species. So presumably some of the species went extinct at some point. Oh, I almost forgot about the bosses. Turns out that most of the bosses are either humans, winglies, or ghosts, but there are 9 unique monsters among all the bosses. So that brings the total up to 95. Though apparently according to the Archangel, half the species of the world went extinct, so that muddies the issue, but I choose to believe that's non-canon because the Archangel at this point is nothing more than a mental manifestation of Miru's. Either way, 108 does check out. Why did I do this? Why did I make myself do so much work just to find a number? Either way, we know a few of the fruits. The 97th were Gigantos, the 98th were Menintos, then dragons, humans, and winglies were 105, 106, and 107 respectively. We all know what humans are, I don't need to explain what dragons are, and Gigantos and Menintos are pretty self-explanatory based on their names.
One of them's a fucking dwarf.
The only one that stands out are winglies. They're humanoid beings that are characterized by their platinum hair and almost ethereal-looking wings. They also have naturally occurring magical abilities, but that comes with a caveat. In the ancient world, Leningrad, which you visit in the game, used to be referred to as the Birth City. It's where they decide the fate of wingly children. If they were deemed not powerful enough, they wouldn't be allowed to be born, and if that strikes you as a bit of Spartan culture, that's probably a deliberate parallel. Although these days it's probably more applicable to the fictional race of Viltrumites from Invincible because it implies that the Wingly magical abilities aren't as naturally occurring as they first appear. But they were bred to be a perfect race. However, they're only the 107th fruit. The 108th divine fruit is said to be the final species, generally referred to as the Moonchild, a great and powerful being that when born would bring a divine gift to the world. However many thousands of years before the events of the game, this ancient Wingly named Melbuframa found the 108th fruit. How? It was never explained. Now obviously, the Moonchild is divine, but it was also a living being, and therefore it was flesh and blood. However, Melbuframa found a way to separate the soul and the body of the Moonchild, and he kept the soul in a crystal sphere. He was already magically gifted, but he also used the power of the soul to enhance his own divine gifts to become the ultimate dictator of the world around him. Nobody could hope to match his awesome power. Nobody among his own race, or any other race, dared to challenge his might. He believed in Wingly supremacy and used that as the basis of his rule. Gee, I wonder who this is based off of. So he oppressed and enslaved all other species for many generations, creating a Wingly utopia off the backs of the huddled, starving masses, until there was an uprising. Led by Emperor Diaz, the humans declared war, and they were led into battle by 7 Dragoon warriors. A Dragoon warrior is a warrior who possesses the soul of a dragon, and with it they're able to fuse into dragon-human hybrids collectively referred to as the Dragoons. It's worth noting that not just anyone can achieve Dragoon form. You have to be chosen by the spirit of the dragon in order to be able to be bonded, and the dragon's chosen warrior can be changed at any given time per the whims of fate. The ensuing war was costly, and in the final battle, the Dragoon warriors defeated Melbuframa at the cost of all but one of their lives. Thus began the Age of Humans. However, during the battle, the crystal sphere containing the soul of the Moonchild was broken, and as such, it was set free. But the soul couldn't simply return to its body, it needed a host to guide its soul to the body, meaning that from that point forward, every 108 years, the soul of the Moonchild would be reborn into an unsuspecting human child. However, every time the Moonchild is reborn, so too is what's referred to as the Black Monster, a hellish demon whose only purpose is to kill the Moonchild and everyone around it, because the Moonchild could also influence the people around it without even trying, as it was the will of the soul of the Moonchild to possess those around it to help it return to its body. By the way, it's worth noting they go out of their way to refer to the Black Monster by male pronouns. Keep that in the back of your mind. 11,000 years after the Dragon campaign, this very thing happens to our protagonist, Dart, whose hometown and parents were caught up in the Black Monster's rampage as it was looking for the Moonchild. Then, as I explained at the top of the video, Dart ends up across the continent somehow, then trains with a swordsman named Master Tasman, and eventually leaves on what is ultimately a fruitless journey to try and find the Black Monster to get his revenge. Only upon his return does he find out that Celeste had been attacked and occupied specifically so that Emperor Dole, at the request of his advisor, this mysterious hooded man, kidnaps Dart's childhood friend and surrogate little sister, Shauna. So yeah, all of that is just backstory to the game. We haven't even gotten to the actual events of the game itself. Now, the game is split into 4 discs, as I said earlier, and each disc encapsulates a specific story arc within the larger story as a whole. As if it's a 4-season TV show with a large overarching plot, but seasonal story arcs. But despite this, Shauna is a tentpole in the middle of the story that everything is built around. She is the linchpin of everything that happens, and you don't really know why until quite a significant ways through the game. Like the opening text says, one mystery begets the next, and for every question that gets answered, 3 more pop up. Although you can probably guess all the twists by the time the big reveal happens. Because I've heard this game is very tropey. I was playing through this game with a friend backseating me, seeing it for the first time, and he was saying it reminded him of a 90s anime. I wouldn't know, I have no point of reference, which I feel probably puts me in a better position than most to enjoy the story of this game, because if you're not familiar with the tropes, then it's probably more of a fresh experience. Now, I already mentioned that part of the reason why I don't generally like JRPGs has to do with my antipathy for anime and anime tropes. Like, yeah, anime isn't one genre, but telenovelas aren't one genre either, but you can't deny there are a lot of recurring tropes that pop up as a result of the culture. And these recurring tropes just tend not to click with me. I have watched anime in the past, I've even liked a few. I was so fucking high when I watched this. Oh my god. But the ones I tend to get into are the more westernized anime, like Cyberpunk Edgerunners. I don't know, there's some sort of intangible element with most anime that just leaves me feeling cold. But if what my friend says is correct and this is stylized more as an old school anime, then perhaps that's the key, because a lot of what I don't like about those sorts of things feels very toned down here. At least from my slightly ignorant point of view, this comes across more as a westernized JRPG, where the setting is somewhat of a standard fantasy setting with its own twist. Every character, with one exception, is a fully grown adult who acts as such, and all the drama feels very believable. Everything feels comparatively sober compared to a lot of other similar games, or at least on the sensible side of absurd. Even then, in hindsight, though, there are a few predictable elements to the story, but even still, while the story doesn't necessarily do anything new, it's well presented with a good progression from a small story into a world-ending catastrophe, likable characters, good character arcs, fun twists and turns, and even a compelling romance or two. And even if I have a hard time articulating why I like this game insofar as how it pertains to my opinions on anime generally, I don't believe it's hard to articulate why I like this story generally. One of the weaknesses of the game, though, is the script insofar as specific word choice. This is the 2-ton whale weighing on the game as far as whether or not you can get personally invested. You can definitely tell the person who translated this didn't have English as their first language, because while everything is mostly coherent with only maybe 2 typos that I noticed, like how Emperor Dole says waxes instead of wakes, the writing comes across as somewhat stilted in a lot of cases, so that characters use specific word combinations that nobody would ever use, and it's just kind of awkward, like this, or this, or this. Fiddle-dee-dee.
SmackDown is really into fisting.
Also, while this sort of thing looks fine in writing, nobody uses contractions. It's always you are instead of your, or I am instead of I'm, and I don't know about you, but in spoken dialogue, people tend to use a lot of contractions. I mean, despite its issues and occasional typos, the script still gets the point across just fine, and there is the occasional line that goes hard. But as I get older, I get less and less forgiving of this, and I really wish I could hack into the game and redo the dialogue to make it feel more natural, but that's the biggest issue I have with the game, and it's perfectly tolerable, especially if you're into the genre and are familiar with the quirks of slightly off-kilter translations. There's plenty to like despite that. It's not perfect, but it works. The game proper starts with a somewhat familiar subject matter in these types of stories: war. You see, the backstory of this game is that 20 years before the events of the game, the country of Serdio was at peace, being ruled by King Carlo. However, the king was assassinated by his brother Dole, and as a result, the country was split into 2. The country of North Serdio, referred to as Basil, ran by the late king's son Albert, and the country of South Serdio, referred to as Imperial Sandora, ran by Emperor Dole. And after 20-odd years of a ceasefire, Imperial Sandora breaks the peace by invading Celeste, the very first thing to happen in the game, which is weird because Celeste is on the Imperial side of the divide, so surely it should have been under the rule of Sandora at the beginning. Maybe the implication is that Sandora and Basil are simply provinces of Serdio that represent the area of influence that the 2 separate sides have, but they don't necessarily control the entire region. Basically meaning that Serdio has a series of city-states that run independently down a dividing line, and attacking and occupying Celeste was less about declaring war and more so an act of aggression to show Sandora is now moving on the offensive. Or perhaps despite the way the country is split on the overworld, maybe the dividing line is more so northwest to southeast, so that Hoax and Celeste are sitting on the dividing line on Basil's side, so I don't know. But either way, the scope of the war that we see at first is somewhat limited due to the fact that we see the whole thing through the eyes of Dart, who at the beginning is more of an independent mercenary without any sort of allegiances except to his friends and his hometown. As far as he's concerned, rescuing Shauna from the grips of Imperial Sandora is the #1 priority, and he doesn't have any plan beyond that. The first thing to really note about the story going into it is that it would be very easy to assume that the Serdian Civil War would take up the entire game, but it's notable for only taking up the first chapter. Yeah, it feels like a big deal, and you fight in battles, you take on supremely powerful beasts, you save the king, and even become a group of insurgents who sneak into the enemy capital and assassinate the emperor, but that's only the first chapter. And that's one of the fundamental tenets of the Legend of Dragoon story that I really like, is that it doesn't necessarily settle on one thing. You're never quite sure where some of these plot lines are going as you solve them. It's a plot that's working on 3 separate levels. On the top layer, you have the overarching story, this grand mystery that unfolds as the game goes on, and it's the connecting thread that keeps you intrigued the more you learn. The main visual indicator of what belongs to the main plot are things called the Divine Moon Objects, which only appear once per chapter but are of extreme vital importance. Also, along with that, you have this mysterious celestial body that keeps showing up called the Moon That Never Sets. What does it represent? What is its purpose? That's what you find out. It's this strange MacGuffin that keeps coming up, but nobody knows its purpose other than the fact that every time the Moonchild is reborn, it glows red, and with that, it's even stated by an astronomer that a celestial body of its kind is astrophysically impossible.
In astronomy, a moon that never sets cannot exist.
Cannot exist?
The Serdian War belongs to what I would argue is the second layer, the chapter-specific stories that weave themselves around the main narrative but are still their own stories that work independently of the main narrative. At first it's the Civil War, but then in Chapter 2 you go to a country named Tiburoa, which is sort of this part tropical, part desert country that's overrun by bandits, and you have to go through and solve the bandit problem yourself. Tied into that is this intrigue surrounding a character named Princess Emile, who had a drastic personality shift circa 6 months before your arrival. She was known as the fairest and kindest person in all the land, but suddenly she's the opposite of what she was known as, and the people are afraid of her, and it turns into this grand conspiracy to take over the country. Then in Chapter 3, I would say the chapter plot that pertains to the second layer of the game is the Divine Dragon. It's a great beast who was captured and subdued in the Mountain of the Mortal Dragon, but it breaks free and has an axe to grind against the humans and the Winglies. And so you need to find a specific object that can weaken it enough for you to be able to fight it, which requires you to work with the Winglies to retrieve one of their sacred items, the Dragon Block Staff, which can weaken the Divine Dragon enough for you to kill it. But then that plot thread concludes about 2/3 of the way through the chapter, and from that point forward, the game is mostly on the first layer and not the second layer, and even before that, there's a massive exposition dump at the beginning of the third chapter about the dragon campaign and the overall mythology of the world, so it quickly becomes clear that this has something to do with the main plot, otherwise they wouldn't be laying it on so thick. But as for the third layer, that's where you get the individual character stories and character arcs. I would say pretty much every character has some grand story to get behind. Dart's story is obviously the most fleshed out on account of him being the main character and the character who's present throughout, I would say, at least 95% of the game. From very early on, Dart is characterized as being extremely headstrong and stubborn, something Shauna even gives him crap for, but he's also fiercely loyal and brave, willing to march into certain death to protect those he loves, which also plays into a protectiveness towards those he loves, which probably stems from the fact that he has trauma over losing his parents when he was 5. And he never wants to lose another person he loves again, and make no mistake, he does love Shauna, even during the portion of the story where he sees her as nothing more than a little sister. He still loves her in the way an older brother loves a little sister. It's only later that he either develops feelings deeper than that for her, or where he's able to break through his own stubbornness and admit he does, and even then there's some optional dialogue that implies that he sees her as more than that during the Queen Fury chunk. It's no secret that when Shauna gets captured, everyone thinks that Dart is absolutely nuts for marching straight into Helena Prison to rescue her, because Helena Prison is considered an extremely dangerous place by which people go into, but nobody ever leaves. As a matter of fact, they even make it a point to mention that Celeste was never meant to be destroyed in the intro. The orders were simply to capture Shauna, however this guy Frugal decided to destroy the city for his own sick amusement, and it just so happens that he's also the warden of this prison and a high-ranking general for Emperor Dole. So you can see what kind of mentality this place is run by. He's a man who gets a sick kick out of the suffering of others, and he kills indiscriminately, whether it be his own prisoners or his own people. He will quite literally go against orders just for the sake of killing people under his control. So that's the type of place that Dart freely marches into just to protect someone he loves. That's partially why I believe that he and Lavitz become such fast friends, because they both fight for a loyalty and a love for those they hold dear. It's not just a team-up of convenience over the fact that they both happen to be in the same place at the same time and had strength in numbers. No, they're clearly kindred spirits. Granted, some people interpret a little bit of bisexuality in their relationship. I disagree, I just think the janky translation lays it on a bit thick at times. Lavitz is the leader of the First Knighthood of Basil, basically making him the highest-ranking soldier in the whole country. He's also a childhood friend of King Albert, the aforementioned King of Basil, which is part of what makes him so loyal to the king. He had the danger of being a bit generically noble and altruistic, but he does have a good chunk of personality, particularly his pragmatism, but also his willingness to talk absolute smack to Dart. A particular highlight would be this moment where they're in what amounts to a carnival, and after giving Shauna and Dart some alone time, Lavitz tries to get the scoop, and he tries to talk some sense into Dart for not being able to see that Shauna clearly has some very strong feelings for him, trying to set him straight from the perspective of a bro to another bro, and also from the perspective of somebody who has the emotional intelligence to see what's going on. Plus, this portion also features a great moment in the scene where Lavitz is suggesting they give Dart and Shauna some alone time, and he tries to take Rose out on a date, and she's having none of it. Yeah, Lavitz, this is what we call Schrodinger's douchebag, doing something douchey and then waiting for people to react negatively to say you're kidding. Plus, he's also a bit of an endearing mama's boy. We meet his mother, and she's insistent that she wants a grandchild in her lifetime, and she's clearly protective of Lavitz, which he acts all defensive about, but the moment he's alone with his mother, you can see that he loves it. Which is really cute, and he also has a bit of a softer side, at one point showing Dart what he feels is his treasure. Get your mind out of the gutter. Which is the view of the castle from the rooftop. There's a certain reverence to this scene where he admits to having used to sit and stare at the castle, dreaming of the day that he could be a powerful knight like his father before him. There's a lot to like about Lavitz. I think he's a solid character, and he doesn't get as much fleshing out as some of the other characters, but well, he's also not in the story as long as the other characters. But I think the big difference between Lavitz and Dart is that Dart openly admits that he's never fought for a larger cause than himself and the people in his immediate vicinity. Meanwhile, Lavitz obviously fights to protect his family, which at this point is just his elderly mother, but he also fights for a sense of loyalty for his king and country. Something he's quite literally willing to die for. I believe that Dart sees that as aspirational, and that begins a chunk of his character arc of deciding to fight for a larger cause than himself. He decides to fight in the war effort, and as a matter of fact, is in many ways the deciding factor between victory and defeat. While he's only one of several different warriors that leads Basil to victory, he becomes the unofficial leader of the group. It's through this decision to fight for something larger than himself that we get a surprisingly nuanced and somewhat philosophical view on war. Obviously, it's not all quiet on the Western Front because there is one side that's obviously a bunch of bastards, but they do a good job at showcasing the suffering that the war has brought, creating orphans, creating refugees, and sending ultimately innocent men to slaughter, showing how there are no enemies in death. That's actually pretty deep. Much deeper than you'd expect for a game with such binary morals. What I believe makes Dart such a compelling character is the fact that his character development has several different layers to it. It starts out merely as him deciding to, like I said, fight for a larger cause than himself, which is what leads him to pursue answers about what's going on with the larger plot beyond the war. Once Dole was defeated, he could have easily walked away. Shauna was safe, the war was over, reconstruction of his home village could have started. But he knew that things were much bigger than that, and he made the decision to continue on. Another part of his character arc is the acceptance of his leadership role. He's a lone wolf. He's never needed to fight alongside anyone else. In a way, he spent much of his life, if not physically, at least mentally alone, because he knew that eventually he was going to pursue the Black Monster. He knew that it was his cross to bear, and as a result, he more or less just slinked off into the night without telling anyone when it was his time to go his own way. But now he's been thrust into this leadership role without even realizing it, and has to take on the responsibility of leading his party into battle and being solely responsible for whatever happens, even as the threat grows to a point of being an existential threat to existence itself. Why is he put into this leadership role despite always having preferred to be alone? Well, it seems that the other members of the group find his spirit aspirational. He simply brings the best out of people without even trying. The third pillar of his character development comes with his desire for revenge. This plays into his stubborn nature, but much of his choice of actions may appear to be altruistic, but are actually somewhat self-motivated, and in many ways can be attributed to his desire for revenge. Here's the thing, despite what some people may disingenuously tell you, suffering due to an undying need for revenge is not a bad character arc or a bad thing to build a story around. It's only bad if it's presented poorly, and I think Dart's single-focused, stubborn mindset mixed with his undying need for justice against the people who have wronged him and the people around him makes for great storytelling, especially when you can see how much it's hurting himself and especially Shauna, who emotionally breaks down over the idea of him refusing to give up his grudges and just come home when this is all done. And it makes sense for her because she obviously feels very strongly for him, but she also lost him for 5 years due to him hunting the Black Monster. He was her rock through thick and thin for most of her life, and she lost him for 5 years, and despite Shauna changing a lot during that time, Dart really hasn't. And as I said at the beginning, part of this game's theming is moving on from the past to make a better future, because it seems like everyone but Dart knows he's gonna waste his life in pursuit of revenge. But in the end, what's it gonna change? It's not gonna bring his parents back, it's not gonna bring his hometown back, and as a matter of fact, it's not gonna bring Lavitz back. Alright, time to spoil this scene, but I already warned you, if you're still watching this without having played the game, this is your own fault. You see, from the very beginning of the game, there's this mysterious hooded figure that seems to show up an awful lot. Somebody implied very early on to work for an even higher power than Emperor Dole. However, if you're observant, you'll notice the same hooded figure standing behind King Albert in his palace. There's even an optional dialogue where you find him in King Albert's room by himself, no doubt doing reconnaissance. But Albert trusts him because he seems so wise, but it's a bit of dramatic irony because we the player know that he's working both sides, specifically it seems to sabotage Basil. But he's also shown to have his own motivations. Meanwhile, during this point in the story where the crew is taking a bit of a break to take part in this hero competition to see who is the strongest in all the world, or at least in the continent of Endinus, this guy Lloyd shows up, a stoic badass in a muscle shirt, who is impossibly strong and impossibly fast, ripping through the competition. He also seems to be speaking in riddles. Despite the fact that you've never met him and you have no idea who he is, he's still speaking as if he knows something you don't. He lays it on real thick in implying that the group will meet him again once the group is stronger, and also rather ominously mentions that Lavitz is no match for him. His entire character at this point is meant to be foreboding, and fittingly so. During the hero competition, thanks to intel from the hooded figure, Bale was sacked, and King Albert gave himself up for execution in order to prevent any of his people from suffering at the hands of Imperial Sandora. So y'all have to break in one more time to save him, and Lavitz does so with admirable gusto. In fact, he wants to run in immediately, but then this happens. And it's funny, the doctor who takes care of you at various times says this when you decide to collectively invade Helena Prison. I have this hilarious thought in my head of the doctor just turning to one of his PAs and saying, "Hey, could you prepare 5 beds? Scratch that, could you prepare 5 coffins?" But yeah, Lavitz runs in all piss and vinegar, putting himself into the line of fire to the point where you wouldn't be mistaken in thinking he has a bit of a death wish. Well, he has one of those things, because after tearing down Helena Prison brick by brick and killing Frugal and his companions including Rodriguez,
Attack!
that mysterious hooded figure shows up again and seems to reach into Albert's body to steal some sort of mysterious object, and without hesitation, for king, country, and friendship, Lavitz leaps into action and immediately gets stabbed in the chest by a weapon of almost indescribable power. A weapon called the Dragon Buster, a weapon specifically forged to kill dragons. He didn't stand a chance, and the hooded man disrobes, and it's Lloyd, the swordsman from before. This random swordsman was orchestrating the entire war, although I guess that begs the question of what was he doing in the hero competition? I understand they had to introduce him, and particularly introduce how unbelievably strong he was so the scene could mean more, but was he scoping out Dart and company to get a feel for how strong they were, or was he just taking the day off? I mean, I guess it makes sense that he needed to bail out of Bale for the time being while the place is invaded, but either way, this scene is the emotional linchpin for the entire game, and it's impeccably presented. The suddenness of the whole thing takes you completely by surprise, every character's reaction shots. Although there is a bit of an unintentionally hilarious moment where Shauna tries to cry into Rose's shoulder and Rose just has a blank expression like, "What the f*** are you doing?" Then there's the emotional music and the fact that they stay on it for a couple of minutes, making it feel like a really big deal. And the way they show Lavitz slowly slipping away but content in the knowledge that his king is safe. Oh man, not a dry eye in the room. Although, why doesn't Lavitz's body vanish like the other dragoons who you defeat? Also, the morbidly funny part is that he may not have actually needed to do this. If Lloyd really wanted to kill Albert, he probably could have either before or after killing Lavitz, so one wonders if his sacrifice was completely pointless. Personally, I headcanon it to that Lloyd was planning on killing Albert, but he inadvertently revealed his identity after killing Lavitz and decided it would be more smart to strategically withdraw. Or perhaps he wanted them to go after Dole, because now that Lloyd got the moon gem from Albert, Dole had overstayed his usefulness. And he wanted the crew to kill him to get rid of the loose end, and he was initially going to inspire them to kill Dole by killing Albert, but killing Lavitz served the same function. You gotta wonder if he's toying with Dart and company at this point. We know he's untouchable one-on-one, but if everyone collectively attacked him at the same time, could he survive? What's his power level in comparison to everyone else at this point? And if Lavitz actually got a good shot in, what kind of damage would it have done? Was Lloyd doing this out of self-preservation, or just cause he could? There's a lot of questions, none of which need to be answered, but it gets you thinking either way. It's one of those cases where I choose to fill in the blanks with my own headcanon to make things that aren't explained make more sense, because if I choose to interpret things that aren't well explained in a way that makes them plot holes, I'm only going out of my way to ruin the story for myself for no reason. Besides, this is something that kind of needed to happen. First of all, we kind of have an inbuilt expectation of main characters having plot armor, but this strips the characters of their pre-assumed invincibility, ensuring that you're never quite convinced that this isn't going to happen again. Second of all, it establishes the seemingly never-ending pursuit of Lloyd, which is the major plot point for a large chunk of the game. Matter of fact, the pursuit of Lloyd is so central to the plot, the second chapter is literally called Platinum Shadow, in reference to his very distinctive hair, and to be honest, that's probably the best chapter name in the game, because it's pretty evocative. Meanwhile, the Serdian War is kind of generic, and chapter 3 and 4 have very similar names with Fate and Soul, and then Moon and Fate. Wish they could have gotten more creative with that. Lloyd serves as the bridge point between the grounded Serdian Civil War storyline and the bonkers places the story will end up going, because Lloyd is imperative in a large-scale conspiracy that is the basis of the mysterious intrigue the game is basing itself around a lot of the time. So it means that the main plot can use the pursuit of Lloyd as an easy means to give the characters a primary goal that they can pursue, and they can use that consistent motion to develop the main plot and have it escalate into a world-ending plot without it feeling jarring. Third of all, it gives the player and Dart a major character motivation to keep going beyond the point in which the fight no longer concerns him or his home, while still keeping with his characterization. He wants justice for what happened to Lavitz, keeping the character arc of Dart's insatiable appetite for justice going beyond even the Black Monster. But in the end, when Lloyd is finally cornered and they're able to throw down once and for all, Dart can't bring himself to do it in spite of the fact that Lloyd is letting Dart kill him, because in the end it won't bring back anybody who's dead. He does sock him one though. Still, it's one of the major culminations of his character arc, knowing that as cathartic as revenge would be, it still wouldn't change anything. Hey Dart, wanna grab your sword? And the funny thing about Lloyd is he actually has a lot more nuance than you may expect, because at first you see him as nothing more than the guy who orchestrated the war, kidnapped Shauna, and killed Lavitz. Somehow everything that happens is some sort of 4D chess move by him. He's the one who recruits half the enemies we encounter, he's the one who's supplying these people with the Dragoon spirits which always seem to end up in our possession. He is seemingly the man behind the curtain. The hatred that the main crew feels for him matches the hatred that you should feel for him if you're into the story. But over time, they begin to pull back the curtain on who he really is and add more layers to him. It's not to say that he's a misunderstood hero masquerading as a villain due to circumstances. He absolutely is still a villainous force through a lot of the game. Aside from all the murder and scheming, I would say one of the more notable examples of being a total reprehensible jackass would be his relationship with Linus. Linus is the primary villain of the second chapter. She's the person who disguised herself as Princess Emile and instituted the bandit takeover of the country. But her primary goal was to stand in as Princess Emile during her 20th birthday celebration, at which point the moon dagger would be handed down to her, at which point she could give it to Lloyd. And the reason that Linus was doing all this was because she was head over heels in love with Lloyd and wanted to do whatever it took for him to reciprocate those feelings, and basically he uses this as a means to emotionally manipulate her into being his puppet, and he clearly had no real feelings for her but was still willing to lead her on to use her for his own selfish needs. And despite everything, even to her dying breath, she still loved him. What a sad, misled girl. So that's pretty messed up, but then he's still capable of doing good at times, particularly in this moment in the second chapter where bandits have overrun the flower city of Donau and are threatening to kidnap and sell this woman, and Lloyd just so happens to be passing by and decides to save her. He also saves her a second time later on, but in that case he had ulterior motives. In this case to get close to Queen Teresa. But Wink, the girl he saves, still takes a sword slash on his behalf to save Lloyd, because she saw him as more than what the Dragoons saw him as. Which is actually his primary story arc, because from the point we learn his true identity, we the audience and the characters in the game believe him to be nothing more than pure evil. But then, between saving Wink twice and his primary motivation, we learn that he's not evil, more so that he's amoral. You see, it's stated in no uncertain terms that everything he does is a means to an end. He wants to bring about a utopia. According to his mentor, a person who alleges to be Emperor Diaz from the Dragon campaign, to do so he must reunite the soul and the body of the Moonchild. Everything he does between A and B is simply collateral damage for what he sees as the greater good. And he kind of ends up emotionally disconnecting from all the things he's done. So he has theoretically righteous motivation, but his methods have resulted in destruction and pain. The fact that his story arc is paralleled by another story arc in the game is probably not a coincidence. Yet in the end, he admits that he had no real reason to save Wink, he just did. And from there, it's decided that he will see his plan through. It probably doesn't take a genius to know that he was being deceived though, and despite his power and his intelligence, Lloyd has a level of naivete that ends up costing him, but we'll save that for the ending chunk. The big question hanging over Lloyd's plan is Shauna's involvement, because there seems to be a mysterious question hanging over her the entire game over what Lloyd wants from her, and also the question of these mysterious abilities that seem to be manifesting within her. Really, everything about her is a mystery. Then again, after a while, it probably doesn't take a genius to know exactly what's going on with her. I mean, between her mysterious abilities and all the talk of the Moonchild being born every 108 years, you can see where they're going with that. I probably wouldn't spoil this as early on had I not been going full tilt with the spoilers, but yes, she is the Moonchild. Hear the Mandrake scream. This isn't properly established until the end of the third disc, but if you haven't figured it out by that point, you probably eat shoes for breakfast. They tease this in the opening cutscene when the general guy holds an item over her head that makes her and the moon glow, which I take for granted at this point, but what even is this? What item is he using which somehow identifies her as the Moonchild, and why does this never come up again? Shauna is characterized by her pure heart, and while that could be seen as a weakness to some, she makes it her strength in how she parlays her pure heart into saving multiple people both in and out of the group. There are multiple instances where she's the reason, or at least part of the reason, why someone's life is spared when they could have easily killed them. There is some ludonarrative synchronicity to her character in the fact that she's the youngest and least experienced of the crew, only being 18 and having less than 5 years of combat experience. As such, that translates into her having the least attack power and among the least amount of health in the game. And her whole thing is that her love for Dart is what inspires her to keep fighting on despite everything. Because after 5 years of him being away, she wants to be with him on his journey no matter what. Which is laying it on a bit thick if you ask me, but then again, it's kind of needed considering how mentally thick Dart is, and hey, Shauna's thick in other ways. Look at that. She's got a whole bakery back there. Now let's talk about female representation in games, because I'm sure this won't spark fiercely angry debate. I think there's an idea in media that strong female characters can only exist if you basically take the stereotypical action hero and give them a vagina. And while that can be one method of doing it, I believe that a character's strength can come from so many different places. Shauna is what you would describe as traditionally feminine. She likes cooking, she aspires to be a housewife, she's very dainty and feminine in her mannerisms, and that's totally fine. Those are her aspirations to have. I believe everyone, male or female, should be able to do what they aspire to do. It's once you start forcing these things on people that I take an issue with it. So her characterization is not a weakness, and in fact, I actually think it's the strength that makes her one of the more compelling characters in the game. Because what is courage? Doing something because you're not afraid? Wrong. It's doing something despite being afraid. And Shauna is clearly in over her head most of the game, but she battles on because she wants to prove that she's stronger than people give her credit for, and because she wants to fight alongside Dart, come hell or high water. And I'm not sure what this says about me, but her pure heart and innocent nature does give me the urge to protect her. Does that make me a white knight? I don't know. I feel like I've expressed so many opinions over the past 2 minutes that would both confirm and deny various labels you can give me that I don't even know where I'm gonna land. Maybe I'll just piss everyone off at once. It's been a while since I've done that. But that's the thing that kind of makes it tragic, that she's the one who has all these mysterious things happening to her. And she's constantly the center of events that she doesn't have the capacity to understand. She's even a liability to the group at times because she hears the voices of these ancient monsters called virages and inadvertently wakes them up on multiple occasions, causing potentially catastrophic danger, but because she's the one least deserving of it, that's what makes you compelled to save her. Which is fitting given the fact that she has mystic abilities both active and passive. It's said that the soul of the Moonchild is so powerful that it can basically influence the people around it. This is why throughout the game, Shauna can befriend basically anyone. She can mentally disarm most people with a look, and can influence people to do what she wants without even trying. She has an unintentional power of persuasion and an aura that attracts people without even trying. And that raises a lot of questions. Does Dart eventually actually reciprocate Shauna's feelings naturally, or is it entirely based around her power gradually breaking down his walls? Is their relationship truly pure, or is her purity creating an impurity in their relationship? With that said though, her weakness of character does manifest annoyingly at times. She's the character most often taken out of commission for story reasons. I mean, it happens twice in the first disc alone, and then again in the third disc, but at least by that point they have somebody to replace her. In the first disc, she gets taken out once because she succumbs to the poison of the dragon's nest, and as such has to ostensibly be cured with something called Dragoni plant, and another time she's taken off the team during the Battle of Hoax. And I feel like in the Battle of Hoax, she would at least try to fight for her position a little bit more than she ended up doing. As in, at all. Like, okay, she wants to cook for the army, fair enough. But I feel like she would at least have objections to sitting on the sidelines while Dart and also, Lavitz go into a potentially deadly battle without her being there to help in whatever way she can. From a story perspective, it makes sense to have characters be taken out of commission for momentary drama so you can have side stories in between the major events. But it's also not necessarily a smart thing to do because this is a game where all XP is split, so even if a character is not in battle, they still level up. But taking them off the team altogether means that they don't get the vital experience they need. This is especially bad if Shauna is part of your main team. I've only played through the game with her once, and inevitably, because of all these multiple points of her being taken off the team, she will fall significantly behind in terms of level ups, which further makes her the least consequential member of the team in battle. But even still, she's a great character in spite of everything, and for what it's worth, I totally had a crush on her growing up, which I feel makes me a bit unique. Because I feel like in terms of volume, people tend to be more attracted to the sternness of Rose or the floaty bimbo-iness of Miru. Hence why the lion's share of fan art for this game is of those two characters. Am I asking for people to make more fan art of Shauna? You bet your ass I am. Also, I think her relationship with Dart is very cute, the way it gradually develops. It's fortunate that there's so much story in this game, so you can have a natural feeling escalation. It's pretty much made no secret that Shauna is into Dart, and multiple people beat him over the head with that fact. You're not necessarily sure if it's stubbornness, emotional density, or a fear of losing any more loved ones that prevents him from pursuing things further. They generally play it up as a combination of the first two, but as with most fiction, you can interpret it however you wish. But it's only once Dart has a near-death experience that they both decide to stop beating around the bush about it. So yeah, what happens is they're sailing on the Queen Fury up north to a city called Fueno, following Linus after she gets away with the Moon Dagger. But at the end of this segment, something weird happens. A ghost ship crashes into the Queen Fury, and you find yourself going through this weird almost time loop where you have all these restless souls reliving a major event. And there are a lot of flags to this segment where you have to go to arbitrary areas in order to move on, but with that said, the ghost ship was actually the site of the previous black monster sighting. And as such, all these ghosts are reliving their failure to keep the person they were supposed to protect alive, a little baby named Princess Luvia. And until they find closure, the ghosts wander the seas, and as events play out, certain characters are used as stand-ins for other characters that were there. More on that later. And once you're able to give the ghosts closure, the ghost ship disappears. However, in their attempts to flee, Dart slips on the spire of the Queen Fury, and Rose is the one who catches him, but she can't save him, so instead of letting him go, she goes with him and ends up saving his life. I guess my question at this point would be, how would they get far enough away that the Queen Fury wouldn't be able to rescue them? I guess Dart's armor is really heavy and probably weighed them down, so it was probably an arduous task to get him to safety, but it seems there really should have been more work in presenting this in such a way that the Queen Fury obviously couldn't rescue them. Either way, Rose nurses Dart back to health on a nearby island, and there's no sense for how long the two of them are gone. I wish there was some dialogue to indicate that they had been gone for like 2 weeks or something. But they make their way back and reunite with the group, with the exception of Shauna, who had been cooped up in her room bawling her eyes out for however long, so Dart rushes to find her. It's worth mentioning that there is 2 separate rooms you can go into, and I always get a kick out of the idea that you can bolt into the wrong room. I just imagine somebody chilling in there and they look at Dart and say, "Nah bro, other room." Also, an inn with only 2 rooms. What is this, Lithuania? But anyway, you go in and them reuniting is the cutest fucking thing. I just can't with this, my broveries are exploding. Just the most pure moment of finding comfort in each other after all the craziness that had happened. After feeling they may never see each other again. It's funny too, I have a friend of mine who says that whenever he used to play God of War Chains of Olympus on PSP, he would turn off the PSP during that QuickTime event where you have to abandon Calliope, because he said that it just felt right, letting them spend more time with each other before having to be separated. And I will admit to having done something similar here in the past, you know, where I just kind of let them sit there for a while before clicking on the next text box. They deserve it. And some people will try and tell you that video games cause violence. And this moment is immediately ruined in an emotional sense, but made absolutely hilarious when it turns out they're being spied on by 3 separate people. Then this leaves Shauna inspired to lay her feelings bare when they have a moment alone later on. And it's finally in that moment where Dart acquiesces to the idea that he may feel the same way. It might have been romantic if they didn't keep getting interrupted over and over like this is a Porky-style sex comedy. Talk about ruining the mood. Then, unlike the first disc, once the final battle in the second disc is concluded, you don't immediately go to disc 3. There's a ceremonial ball held in your honor for saving the country. They insist that the women wear dresses, but Shauna is the only one who accepts the offer. Then later at the ball, she finally shows up and has a quiet, intimate moment with Dart where they finally kiss. I don't mean to be dramatic, but this was a standing up and clapping moment for me growing up. Here's a bit of an embarrassing confession. I mean, it's embarrassing for me, but it's probably benign as fuck. Back when I was too young to be home alone and I would be driven around by my mother, there was a rotation of like 20 songs that would play on the radio, to the point where I even developed a bit of a complex against some of them. That "Ooh, Baby Please Don't Go" song is practically a trigger for me at this point. But Blackbird, not the Alter Bridge song, the Beatles song, although it was a cover by some other singer. Well anyways, Blackbird was part of that rotation, and ever since I was very young, I always imagined the chorus to that song accompanying this moment. You know, like, "We have all been waiting for this moment to arrive." To be clear, those aren't the lyrics, but that's what I thought the lyrics were back then. It's "arise," not "arrive." Though I'm not sure if that's inappropriate considering I'm pretty sure that song is about civil rights. But anyways, after 2 discs and 20 hours worth of character development, this was an incredibly emotionally cathartic payoff. But of course, since this is the halfway point of the game, you know that things are gonna go very wrong very fast. She starts having celestial hot flashes, which turns her into a liability because it affects her ability to fight, and then her Dragoon even rejects her, forcing everyone to temporarily go on without her while she's under the auspices of her mother, Queen Teresa, the queen of the northern country and the setting of the 3rd disc. I've never been sure how to pronounce this. Mil Si Xiao? Or some shit. Yeah, this was actually a twist that was not played up at all, and I'm also glad it wasn't. So it turns out that the Black Monster was mistaken. 18 years prior, the Black Monster went after Princess Luvia, thinking that she was the Moonchild. Turns out that Princess actually had a twin sister who was sent away for her safety. And that twin sister just so happened to be Shauna. I've heard the whole secret princess thing is a massive cliche in JRPGs, and so I'm kind of glad that this was something that was never really played up, because that could have been very cringe, but the fact that it's never even brought up makes me think that they never even drew the connection. But either way, the fact that Shauna is the twin sister of Princess Luvia is why the ghosts on the ghost ship reacted to her as if she was the princess, which will make it plain as day why the ghosts were also attacking Rose, accusing her of being the Black Monster. It's not plainly said until the end of the 3rd disc, but if you haven't figured it out by that point, you probably eat shoes for— oh, I already said that. Rose is the enigma of the group. She's positioned deliberately as the one who you can never emotionally read, like the very first thing she does is save Dart's ass from a dragon at the beginning of the game. She doesn't need to save him, but she does anyway. This is the first time you see the mysterious glow that's attributed to the Dragoon spirits. Her Dragoon spirit reacted to him, and so she realizes that he possesses a spirit himself, and then later on, when he's at the mercy of Kongol, she saves him again when she activates said Dragoon spirit. And from that point forward, she's a part of the crew, but she's also deliberately very distant, going out of her way to refuse any sort of conversation about her past or what her motivations are. And she's incredibly cold whenever any sort of attempt to reach her is broached. All we know is that her friends are dead, she's a loner, and she sticks around because on one hand she likes these people, and on the other hand she coyly says they feel naked without her. That's a line she uses multiple times, by the way. I feel like they were trying to bring something across. Honestly, between her all-black costume and the fact that one of her additions is called Whip Smack, I almost feel like there's a bit of a BDSM undercurrent to her character. Am I the only one? Anyways, what we the audience know is that she has experienced some sort of trauma and as such has emotionally closed herself off from the rest of the world. We get the first hint at this during the Shrine of Shirley segment of the game. This is the part of the game where we're trying to find the cure for the poison that put Shauna in a coma. While I wasn't necessarily happy with them taking Shauna out of commission, this is low-key one of the best parts of the game for storytelling. Aside from all the treasure in the place being rigged, all the puzzles you have to figure out, and the area being a giant booby trap set up by this guy named Drake the Bandit, I've heard he likes them young, once we're tragically forced to deal with him, a ghost of a woman named Shirley shows up who seems to have a connection to Rose. They're a little bit coy about the specifics. We do know that when she was alive, Shirley was a friend of Rose's. But this leads to that terrific subversive boss fight where we have to lay our hearts out and confront the negative pieces of ourself until she gives us the Silver Dragoon spirit, which has the power to heal Shauna. The idea that Shirley knows Rose and they have such reverence for each other is only the first hint at a larger intrigue with Rose, which is eventually paid off when we the audience are told her story about a third of the way through the game. While she's nursing Dart back to health, she has a flashback and it shows the final battle of the Dragon campaign where Melbuframa was defeated, but she also witnessed all her friends die for the cause. And the love of her life, this guy named Zieg, was petrified, leaving her the only survivor, and the fact that she couldn't save her love all those years before traumatized her. Which is what compelled her to risk her life to save Dart. She refused to let go again. Part of this is the fact that Dart reminds her of Zieg. It's worth saying that some people attribute this to Rose having a crush on Dart. I don't see that. The fact that she sees a piece of her lost love in him might fool you into thinking that, but for me it comes across more as a fascination. She's still very much in love with the man she lost 11,000 years previous. Granted, it does muddy the issue a bit when they're found in a slightly intimate position in the morning and this kid gives her crap for it. It's a beautiful moment of vulnerability that only the audience is privy to. And it really showcases Rose's loneliness and longing for something she can never have again, showcasing the tragedy that she's had to live with for the vast majority of her life. And it helps to convey one of the other main themes of this game, which is a longing for a lost love. At least 6 different main characters in some way have been separated from or lost someone they love. And they each go on their own personal journeys to find that love again, or in Rose's case, she has to live with the longing for thousands of years. But how has she stayed alive all these years? Well, that's the thing. After the Dragon campaign, and after the soul of the Moonchild was released into the world, somebody had to prevent the soul and the body of the Moonchild from ever reuniting. Why? More on that later. So arrangements were made for Rose to become effectively immortal so that every 108 years, she could perform her solemn duty of killing the Moonchild. That's right, Rose is the Black Monster. Like I said, a shocking twist that should shock nobody. The people on the ghost ship, the similarities between her dragoon form and the silhouettes of the black monster, the fact that she gets defensive whenever the topic comes up, it's plain as day for everyone to see. And that's also partially why she lives in such despair, because she's had to disassociate from all of humanity for 11,000 years, as well as disassociate from morality in order to do something she doesn't want to do but has to do. And part of her character arc is finding her humanity once more, being able to use these new personal connections in order to find that long dormant happiness within herself, which she achieves. If only for a moment, she giggles to herself softly at the end of the second disc and immediately becomes self-conscious about it. And it's a sight to behold, so I like Rose. Seeing her coming out of her shell and seeing her duality is compelling. Plus, the ever-evolving mystery surrounding her character that evolves along with the story itself is also very intriguing. But then she's kind of forced to revert back to her previous loner personality when she's outed as the Black Monster, and that's tragic. Because you know for a fact she doesn't like what she has to do, and she also hates the idea that people hate her for something that she needs to do. It's an effective Uno reverse moment where you have to re-examine what she's done and the morality thereof. But there is one thing I kind of wonder about her. If she came clean, could she have stopped Lloyd and Diaz? Because Lloyd is convinced that he's doing the right thing and even tells the group what he thinks is going to happen when he gives over the Divine Moon objects to Diaz. But Rose knows the truth. She even gets passive-aggressive about it, but pulls back when revealing the truth could have resulted in her outing herself as the Black Monster. But if she just threw caution to the wind and told the truth, could she have prevented the ultimate plan from happening? Or would they have immediately distrusted her? It makes sense why she doesn't, because she is into the whole self-preservation thing. Once it's revealed that she was the black monster, she was so convinced that Dart was gonna kill her that she even tries to let him, not being sure if the situation with Lloyd had allowed him to mature enough to be able to let go of the grudge with the black monster. Besides, at this point she thinks it's all pointless because she's convinced that the Moonchild is dead, so getting the Divine Moon objects would be ultimately fruitless. But that still begs the question for me, if she came clean and explained what was really going on to Lloyd, how much could she have stopped? Now, to get back to the very divisive topic of female representation, while Shauna is more of a traditionally feminine character, Rose represents a more stereotypical badass action girl in her personality and mannerisms. And the fact that they represent both ends of the spectrum is what I like. They're doing their best to represent the different ranges of character portrayal. So you have a variety of personalities, not just for male characters, but also female characters. Which I guess kind of brings up the question of which side of the spectrum Miru lands on. I guess that's a good question because I really don't know. She's kind of all over the place. Miru is a fan favorite for reasons. Okay, let's just call a spade a spade. She's the token girl in an armored bikini, and a significant chunk of the fan base is horny for her, but hey, the internet is horny. Nothing wrong with that. Like I said, I'm just calling a spade here. My only apprehension is the fact that she is technically 16. But you know what they say, all characters are depicted as etc, etc, etc. Depending on your tolerance level for her sort of character, she'll either be your favorite or least favorite character of the crew. She's a floaty, kooky, hyperactive teenaged girl. Aside from her appearance, I think it's her fun, playful nature that draws people to her. She's very emotional and very animated, often having bursts of manic energy that even the characters in the game think is weird. And so you'll either find her a very fun character or annoying, and I feel like that was the intention as well, given that the first dialogue you have with her technically gives you an option to refuse her entry into your crew, though it's a but thou must option and you really don't have a choice. She kind of latches onto the crew sight unseen for the fact that she wants to help them rescue Lin, who was attempting to solve the Tiburoa bandit issue by himself. But she stays with the crew because she feels a kinship with them, and then she even gets her own Dragoon spirit, which helps things along. She's one of those characters that at first I found annoying in a way that only teenagers can be, but then as the story goes on, she gains a level of usefulness and a likability when you get a deeper fleshing out of her personality. See, that's the funny thing. After the Valley of Corrupted Gravity, she doesn't really have much usefulness for a while, and you may question her necessity in the plot at that point. But after the boss fight with Linus is quick to point out some vague connection between her and Miru. And not just the fact that they're both one jutting nail away from no longer having pants. This is when it's revealed that Linus is a Wingly. This is obviously foreshadowing some of the plot for later because the physical similarities for both of them are too coincidental. Then you remember that Lloyd also has the same platinum hair that they do. This is an indication that all platinum-haired characters in the game are Winglies. And come Chapter 3, this is what helps Miru develop into a well-rounded character. She was raised as a Wingly and raised to hate humans, but also she had ambitions to see the world because she was sick of being stuck in their little concealed forest kingdom for her entire life. So she ran away to live with the humans, and she grew an affection for them, and as such, she wants to be the conduit for breaking down the xenophobic barriers between the Winglies and the humans that have persisted since the dawn of time. And you can see the depths of sadness and isolation she feels is directly caused by the rejection she receives from her people from wanting to walk her own path instead of following the same isolationist path that all her ancestors walked. That's why she latches onto the group so quickly. She feels the potential for a connection that she's been missing and doesn't hesitate. Yet she's so used to the xenophobia in her upbringing that she's deathly afraid of revealing her secret to her friends lest they have the same feelings inside of them. You get the sense that she's very anxious and performative, just wanting to be accepted, which is something we can all get behind, and in the end, she's the one who builds the bridge between the Winglies and the humans when they need to work together to fight for a common cause, in this case being the threat of the Divine Dragon. Which not only plays into the themes of letting go of the past to create a better future, but it's also indicative of something that you see a lot throughout history. Where you can't necessarily unite people with a common goal, you can only unite them with a common enemy. And while this is a relationship born out of necessity, there are signs later on to indicate that this was the beginning of a reintegration between Winglies and humans. And it's all due to this one slightly annoying hanger-on. The biggest part of the Winglies overcoming their xenophobia towards the humans manifests when they have to let the humans into the Forbidden Land. The Forbidden Land is the area where the final battle of the Dragon campaign happened, and so it's an incredible sore spot to the Winglies still holding on to that age-old grudge. Yet, this is the thing both sides need to overcome to survive. Even if there are a few people who believe they're strong enough to survive on their own, all must put their pride aside to face the past or they won't have a future. Miru also has a fiancé that the rest of the crew was unaware of, and it sucks for that guy to have his fiancé be the village outcast. He's sort of on her side, but still wishes that she would come home. Which is funny because her sins are wanting to subvert their traditions, meanwhile you have people actively going out of their way to try and kill humans who aren't even in their sanctuary. And somehow, they think that they're the good guys. Although in fairness, the Bardell brothers do actually have an axe to grind against humans. Apparently they had a younger sister who was inspired to leave the forest after Miru left, and she was apparently killed by a human. I always thought the little sister in question was Linus, but apparently it was some other unnamed character. But anyways, another one of the things that I really like about Miru is her relationship with Haschel. I love their dynamic. They really do seem to share a single brain cell. They're always just goofing off with each other and making quips, and they grow into an almost surrogate father-daughter relationship, which is very endearing, and part of that is because Haschel himself is also a very big goofball. He's a very fun character who's basically characterized by being too old to give a damn, so he'll joke around, he'll give people shit, he'll make inappropriate comments. I love him. One of my favorite unsung moments in the game was how after Dart and Rose are reunited with the crew, Miru, who has a subplot about trying to figure out what love is and trying to figure out what relationships are, asks Dart and Rose if they found themselves in any intimate situations while they were shipwrecked. Haschel is quick to tell her how inappropriate it is to ask, only for him to immediately pipe up and say, "So Dart, did you cuddle with Rose?" Dear God, it cracks me up every single time. But despite being happy-go-lucky, he can and often does get very serious when he, as the scientific term goes, locks in. He takes nothing serious but the fight. Haschel is the leader of a martial arts discipline called the Rogue School, so named because it's based on his home island of Rogue. During their travels, Dart and Haschel meet at some point and prove to be great friends. An interaction I would love to see, and if this game ever did get a remake, I would like flashback quests to fill in some of these blanks. Because I feel like that would be fun, but that's how he joins the crew. He runs into Dart at the hero competition, and promised to meet in the finals only for Haschel to be taken out by Lloyd. And once he finds out that Bale is under occupation, he decides to suspend his travels and help them out. Matter of fact, he was actually going to leave them to their own devices at the end of the first disc until the Dragoon spirit that Dole had then bonded itself to Haschel. So he decided that fate had brought them together and he would stay. If there's one thing I will say against him as a character, it's that because he's from such a remote area of the world, they do kind of have to keep shoehorning in story elements that are relevant to him, such as how one of the chiefs of the bandits is a former student of his. As such, all the bandits are trained in Rogue School techniques, and then there's also another plot beat towards the end of the game where they establish that one of the major MacGuffins is near Rogue. So they need to travel there, so his characterization is great, but his story involvement can be a bit mixed at times, which is funny because they had a perfectly good storyline there with him that they never really capitalized on. The reason he's been traveling for 20 years is because he's looking for his missing daughter. He did a classic parent move of attempting to have his legacy live on through his daughter, and as such he wanted her to be the best martial artist she could be. But he was so aggressive and pushed her so hard he caused her to make a fatal error, either knocking out or possibly killing her sparring partner, which caused her to run away in shame. So at the age of 60, he's been fruitlessly searching for her for a third of his life. They have a Chekhov's gun moment in the second disc when the crew happens to stumble upon a bridge called Clare Bridge, which just so happens to be both the name of Dart's mother and Haschel's daughter. So they float the idea that, oh, maybe we're related, but that quickly gets shot down by everyone, including Rose, with a hilarious putdown. Let's go, he won't finish talking till dusk. I didn't mention this, but Rose has such a great dry wit at times. Of course, they wouldn't bring something up like this unless it would become a bigger deal. Cutscenes don't make themselves. And it is true, at the beginning of Chapter 3, Shauna sings a lullaby to a child, and she says it's a lullaby that Dart used to sing to her when they were children, and Dart learned the lullaby from his mother. At which point we flash back to Haschel's daughter some 27 years earlier singing that very lullaby. It slaps Haschel in the face that fate had brought him together with his own grandson. And you know what? That's the last we hear about it. I'm not a fan of that. I feel like this should have been a much bigger deal and really should have played into the story much more. But Haschel doesn't bring it up again, not until the end of the game, as in right before the final boss does he mention to Dart that Dart actually does very much resemble what Haschel looked like when he was young. Yeah, these two could have practically been the same person, give or take 40 years. That was sarcasm, by the way. I'll give the Tan a pass. Haschel lived on a tropical island, but looking at Dart's father and looking at Haschel, Haschel's genes didn't even try. But the fact is, this could have made for some good drama, and also could have driven a wedge between the characters at times. Because here's the thing, if Claire was killed during the Black Monster's rampage and it's revealed that Rose was the Black Monster, don't you think that would have come up once or twice that Rose killed Claire? Like, Dart being able to forgive Rose was one thing, but Haschel's connection to the Black Monster's rampage was never even addressed. I'm sure he would have been able to forgive Rose because Haschel definitely blames himself for what happened, but at the same time, the fact that it wasn't brought up at all seems a bit weak. I wonder if the writers even realized that this connection existed. So that's a bit lame, and yeah, the Haschel relevant parts of the story aren't great, but once again, Haschel is a great character in himself, often stealing the scene at any given time he's involved. Now there are 3 other main characters in the crew, and the reason why I've saved them for last is because, well, to be honest, they're kind of the least story relevant. Which makes sense, in an ensemble cast, not everyone's gonna get equal billing. The most tragic of them is probably Albert, because he's introduced very early on, and in the Serdian War he's obviously an integral character, but once he gives up his kingliness, that's a word my sister used to use to describe it. Once he gives up his kingliness for the time being in order to go on the quest, he kind of loses a lot of his story relevance, because you're kind of taking the character out of his primary setting and taking away his primary characteristic, and not really replacing it with anything for a lot of the game. Especially because his reasons for coming along on the journey is obviously, apart from being chosen by the Dragoon spirit, is to pursue Lloyd in memory of Lavitz. And also a general sense of duty for the world even beyond his kingdom, but going after Lavitz's killer is already taken up by Dart, so Albert having that motivation seems a bit, well, not redundant because he has a bigger axe to grind because he knew Lavitz for much longer, but it's still diluted a bit. Albert is characterized obviously by his nobility and his proper nature. He has a bit of a hard time fitting into the group on account of his elevated status, making him a little bit out of touch. He speaks in a more flowery, grandiose way, or inadvertently flaunts his higher education. Like that time they go to the Grand Library, and he damn near has a panic attack over the idea of having access to such knowledge. There's this entire story beat at the beginning of the second disc where you have to find a specific flag to skip to the next day so you can leave town, and all it is getting into a conversation with this lady who's trying to restore greenery to Tiburoa, and Albert then has a botany discussion with her until morning. And that just says it all, but he is notably humble, wishing to be treated as an equal within the group rather than given special treatment. Matter of fact, this is showcased pretty much from the moment he joins the crew. Immediately after they get out of Helena prison, they have to clear some debris in order to get into a cellar, and they insist that he has no obligation to help them, but he insists that he wants to. And once they get to Tiburoa, he insists that they don't call him Your Highness, and even prefers that they don't use his royal status as a means to help them out. So that makes him a relatively interesting character, just wanting to be accepted as a normal person despite very easily being able to flex his status, though it is mildly dumb that they could have just flexed the fact that he was king in order to gain an audience with King Zawar so they could continue on their quest because they needed a permit to go to the Valley of Corrupted Gravity, especially because he finds out anyway. Yeah, King Zawar is the king of Tiburoa, and despite being a pretty nothing character in the story, he's still important enough to have an epilogue. But instead of flexing the royal status, you need to go through a series of flags to endear yourself to this astronomer named Fester, who is the royal astronomy teacher for Princess Elisa, the other princess who is thankfully at least more of a character than Zawar. And through Fester, you can get an audience with the king, but the major issue with Albert is that he doesn't really have a story, at least a story unique to him. With the exception of his infatuation with Princess Emile, he was obviously in love with her before he had ever seen her, and was heartbroken when she appeared to have been a different person to what he had heard. And when they find out where the real Princess Emile is being held, he's the one finally able to wake her up. Only through yelling at her, not as I would have hoped, through slapping her, because that would have been funny. Then, once it's all said and done, they immediately fall in love with each other. I mean, there's this absolutely unbearably cringeworthy scene where the real Princess Emile shows up for the first time in 6 months, and everybody's fawning over her, and I swear to God, if you can get through this entire scene while still holding in your lunch, you're a better man than I. But there is a moment after the cutscene where Albert is awestruck after what he just witnessed, and I do get a kick out of imagining him slack-jawed and drooling, but that little bit of juice is really not worth the squeeze. They have one more mandatory scene later on before they meet at the ball at the end of Chapter 2, and this is where Albert proves himself to be a hopeless romantic and a poet, which Dart gives him shit for. And then at the ball, they're declaring their love for each other and how he can't wait to see her again, and I'm like, barf. The sad fact about this particular relationship is that the two of them have almost no screen time together, and they have next to no chemistry, so it falls flat, leading Albert to fall flat story-wise. Fine enough character, but I vastly prefer Lavitz to him. The final of the 7 character slots, though not the final playable character introduced, is Kongal. He's the biggest victim of the fact that not every character can get equal screen time because everything up to the point in which he joins the party is great. He's the victim more than anything. Despite initially being a villain, he's the last of the Gigantos. The Gigantos were a race of people that, as it sounds, were giant humanoids, 10 feet tall and built like tanks. But they were wiped out by humans. We don't have a clear idea of who wiped them out, all we know is that they were wiped out, I guess between 20 to 40 years before the events of the game. Kongal seemed to have been the only surviving member of the race, and he was taken in by Dole, who promised a world in which all species can coexist equally. I believe the Giganto genocide was basically used to illustrate that despite the fact that humans and Gigantos among other creatures were subjugated under the Winglies for thousands of years, humans are just as capable of being horrible xenophobic bastards as the Winglies were. And in the end, Kongal is the last one to bear the weight of his people's suffering. But having been saved and taken in by Dole, he became fiercely loyal to Dole. On the personality side, he speaks in broken caveman English, he's established to be illiterate to human writing, and he also has a hard time understanding a lot of basic concepts. Still, he's used as one of the primary building blocks of Dole's army, and as a matter of fact, almost kills Dart during the Battle of Hoax. But not to be discouraged, he comes back at the end of the chapter as the last line of defense before fighting Dole himself. Of course, it doesn't go his way, but a moment of compassion is what ultimately saves him and what saves the rest of the crew. Dart and Shauna both decide that he's defeated and it would be cruel to kill him, so they decide to leave him alive when they went off to fight the final boss. But with Imperial Sandora gone, so too is Kongal's meaning of life, so he decides to follow the crew. Not immediately though, he doesn't show up until you find yourself in the home of the Gigantos, rescuing Lyn as well as getting Dart's Dragoon back. The battle with Garrick causes a giant stone statue to break and it nearly crushes the whole gang, but he shows up in the nick of time and saves them. So their compassion ultimately saves them. Kongal followed them and decided he wanted to join because you showed him compassion and now he believes he owes his life to you, but also gravitates towards you because you're powerful in the same way that Dole was powerful and he wants to see whatever it is that the crew is able to do with their power. It's not until later does he understand what it means to be friends and that people do care about him. He's even shown training alone at one point considering this and growing to appreciate it. So that's a great story arc. I'm a sucker for a good villain turned ally plot, and I find Kongal to be an endearing character that I'm happy to see live happily. Especially after everything he's been through. Problem is though, as soon as he joins the gang, he basically does jack all of shit for the rest of the game. He essentially becomes a comedy character, having his size be the main butt of the joke. Like, there's one particular moment in the 4th disc where if you get captured by the Xenobotos automated police bot, you find yourself in a sealed-off prison cell, but Kongal is too big to teleport, so just as everyone is losing hope, he Kool-Aid mans himself through the wall. As funny as that is, that's pretty representative of his involvement in the game. He doesn't even pop out of Dart's body very often. Granted, he does have a few specific character moments during a couple of the story segments. Those are some of my favorite parts of the game. Every now and again, you're obliged to interact with every single character in the crew and are obliged to get their thoughts on what's going on and how it's affecting them. It really gives you a deeper insight into the characters, and I can't get too much of this sort of thing. Even after something as seemingly insignificant as fighting a Virage in the Valley of Corrupted Gravity, everyone sits for a few minutes and ponders what's going on. But the two best story-heavy segments like these in the game definitely take place during the 2nd chapter. You may have guessed from the fact that I've spent a pretty significant chunk of the story segment on it, but I think Chapter 2 is my favorite part of the game. It's the shortest chapter, but it's also my favorite because it's the most character-driven of all the chapters. The first chapter is a lot of setup, and as such, by the end of the chapter, most characters and character plots are introduced, but by no means established. By the third chapter, the overarching plot starts to overtake the character-driven aspects of the plot as major character arcs are wrapped up and big reveals start happening relevant to the final chapter. And the final chapter is essentially all main plot. And as I'll discuss later, that's where things start to get less interesting, and I think part of that is because I don't think the main plot is as interesting as these characters. I'm invested in their individual struggles and individual growth. And I'm definitely invested in the main plot as well, just not as much as the characters themselves. This is where Dart begins to finally see how his thirst for revenge is harming Shauna. It's also where he finally opens up to her. This is the chapter where Rose is able to start opening up and she finds her smile again. This is the chapter where we meet Miru. It's the chapter where Kongol's story arc is paid off. And while the other characters' story arcs aren't as integral to this chapter, there's enough of what I like about these characters that they also have their moments to shine, particularly in the aforementioned two completely character-driven segments. While the party is on the Queen Fury and they're traveling to Fueno, you control each one of them for a moment as they're dealing with their struggles. And of course, there's the part at the end of the chapter with like 4 great moments I've already gone over. Which is funny because Haschel and Miru don't even have a story arc to complete in this chapter, they're just bugging the cooks in the kitchen. Like I said, they share a brain cell. But either way, it's all very endearing and goes to give this game a lot of character resolution in the halfway point, and the rest of the game can't really keep up, especially because they have to replace Shauna at the 11th hour. So step right up, Miranda, the favorite character of exactly nobody. She's one of the Sacred Sisters of however this country is pronounced, who was a group of women who aren't quite princesses under Queen Teresa, but pretty much serve the same function. She latches onto the group because the Divine Dragon conflict concerns her country, especially once it destroys the city of Leningrad. But she's also easily the weakest character out of everyone on the crew because she only shows up about a third of the way through Chapter 3, which means she only has 1 2/3 chapters to be fleshed out.
And then you add Kurt Angle to the mix!
In fact, less than that, because there's really no room for much character development after a certain point. So they have next to no chance to make her the focus of any of these scenes, and what they do come up with just feels really shoehorned. First of all, her personality is very bland. She's stoic and no nonsense, but not in a looming darkness from something she's not telling you sort of way like Rose, but more so in a they forgot to give me personality sort of way. She's kind of noble as well, but she also has occasional bursts of hostility that, unlike Rose, don't feel earned. She feels pointlessly antagonistic a lot of the time. I guess the fact that I'm comparing her to Rose so much in her character explanation kind of paints the picture of why she's such a weak character, because her personality feels very much like a more poorly done, more poorly established version of Rose, and with none of the story context that justifies her personality. Her main story arc involves issues with her mother. Apparently Miranda's mother used to beat her, and she has a psychological complex against roses because there would always be a vase full of roses behind Miranda's mother as she was beating Miranda.
Excuse me, what?
Which is only established so that they can have a really contrived means to have Miranda trauma dump all over Haschel, to which I wish he would have just said, okay, but who asked? But then her mother also abandoned her, causing her psychological issues. But she was also taken in by Queen Teresa, so like, get over it? But then they Uno reverse card this whole plot in the most haphazard way. They make the mother out to be the good guy when it turns out Miranda's father was actually a drunk and was pissing away all their money, and Miranda's mother ran away for her own well-being and even tried to come back many times to rescue Miranda, but the father refused. And yet, in this flashback, this is completely contradicted. The father is nowhere to be found, and the mother just walks away, abandoning Miranda. She could have taken Miranda in this moment, but she didn't. So bullshit she tried to save Miranda. She could have saved her right here. Which is all well and good except for the fact that she was beating Miranda. Yeah, I'm sorry, but any positive intentions is nullified when it's revealed that she was beating her daughter. That kinda cancels out everything, because there's no justifying that. Sure, moving on from the past to make a better future is all well and good, but this character arc is just laughable. So whatever you want to say about this story, it is completely haphazard. How they thought the mother deserved forgiveness when the story is presented like this is a mystery to me. She can take that pity party and shove it. And then they also try to make it a point that Miranda being as brash as she is entirely down to her resentment for being abandoned, and that's another thing that has no setup, and I guess this is the payoff, and it's not very good. And the funny thing is that much like Haschel, there was an obvious story arc for her staring them in the face. Miranda is an outsider. She only shows up in the group towards the end of the game, and I feel like there should have been conflict in the group over the idea that she's an outsider and hadn't really earned her stripes, so to speak. You can even play up the idea that she's replacing Shauna and the rest of the group, especially Dart, is resentful of that fact, and then you can turn that into a whole thing about how Miranda's been an outsider for her entire life because despite being a sacred sister, she's never been fully accepted on account of the fact that she didn't come from nobility. That's an easy story arc that you can pull off in a chapter. Introducing familial abuse is something that takes a lot more setup and a lot more payoff. It's funny, you know, I've been accused in the past of glazing this game and ignoring its issues. Oh no, I don't ignore its issues. I will always critique even my favorite games because I'm a critic. It's what I do. And Legend of Dragoon isn't perfect, far from it, but it is still, for many reasons, one of my favorite stories in the history of gaming, and what really ties a lot of it together for me is the world. The world just feels very lived in, with an intriguing lore, an extensive landmass with so many different places to explore, so many minor details, so many interesting characters, so many of which that I could never hope to go over all of them. It's one of those cases where the more I learn, the more I want to learn. I want to deep dive into every facet of the history and mythology. Talk to every character. It's a world I want to immerse myself in, and it's one of the reasons why it's a shame that the game is a singular entity, because it is a finite space that I wish was less finite. I wish that I could immerse myself into the world even more, and yet I feel like this might be the appeal of it as well, the allure of the fact that it feels like this game is merely the tip of the iceberg of the overall experience. And even the tip of the iceberg is more detailed, varied, and interesting than pretty much any other game I've ever played. But as much as we would like to have certain adventures go on forever, as much as we would like to have the finite be infinite, every storm ends. And as such, there's only one major topic left to discuss, and that is the ending of the game, the 4th chapter, which, as I've said multiple times, is what I feel is the weakest part of the game. I think the 4th disc is where I feel the story starts to unravel a bit. I've heard it said that the game falls apart at the end. I wouldn't go that far, but it's definitely the weakest part. Mostly because the entire scope of the plot is revealed at the end of the 3rd disc, so the entire 4th disc has no mystery to it. So at the end of the 3rd disc, Shauna is kidnapped from the Leningrad Inn by Emperor Diaz, or the person claiming to be him. If you don't remember, Emperor Diaz was the person who initiated the Dragon campaign 11,000 years previous, and was the person alleging to be guiding Lloyd in his quest to create a utopia. I know I already went over all of that, but this is a fucking long video, so I feel like I probably need to reacquaint you with certain things. And Emperor Diaz, or the person claiming to be him, says he'll trade Shauna for the 3 Divine Moon objects, and it all culminates in Velweb, the capital city of Gloriano, where the war began, the edge of the world. You started this game at the bottom right corner of Endedness, and the culmination is at the top left. Everything has been leading you to this, and there is a lot they get through here. This is where it's revealed that Rose is the Black Monster and that Shauna is the Moonchild, but you probably already know that, like I said. It's really obvious, and then it's revealed that Diaz had been tricking Lloyd the whole time. Once again, doesn't take a genius to figure that out. The 3 Divine Moon objects are the keys to freeing the body of the Moonchild so the body and the soul can be reunited. They've been saying throughout the entire game that when the Moonchild is born, it will bring a divine gift to the world. It turns out the divine gift is destruction. Yeah, the 108th fruit is actually the god of destruction. A failsafe in case the creator Soa wanted to destroy the world and try again. That's why the Black Monster had to kill the Moonchild every time it was born, and why it's a fatal mistake that Rose mistook the wrong person as the Moonchild. Shauna is the key to bringing about the end of the world, and on top of that, the final twist, the ultimate punctuation on this scene, the person alleging to be Emperor Diaz is Dart's father, who allegedly died when Neat was destroyed by the Black Monster, but he somehow survived. However, his father just so happens to also be Zieg, Rose's lost love from 11,000 years previous. What in the goddamn? This is the revelation that makes a lot of things suddenly make a lot of sense. Most notably how the people who Lloyd recruited always seemed to have a Dragoon spirit, because his boss was one of the originals and probably had all of them stashed away. With everything made clear, almost everyone's character arcs complete, and a clear direction, the 4th disc is a lot less interesting. Because it's mostly just going through the motions until the end, and we know we're gonna mostly fail, because it would be a lot less interesting if we actually succeeded in stopping the body and soul from being reunited. We have to go straight to the precipice before ultimate triumph. So after a short bit of exposition where we trundle our way through the Death Frontier, a dead land which sits in ancient Wingley City, we go off to save the world. Now, what do? Well, we have to stop the moon that never sets from falling to Earth. Yeah, that thing that's constantly in the background, constantly considered to be a major set piece, and the thing that's causing Shauna's celestial hot flashes, but we're never quite sure what it is, or what its purpose is. Well, it turns out that it's not a moon, it's not a space station, but it's actually the body of the Moonchild. The reason it's being held in the sky is because of the Signet Spheres, these beacons of ultra-powerful Wingley magic that suspend it in the sky. They also have a secondary function, or possibly a primary function depending on how you interpret it, to limit the power of the soul of the Moonchild, therefore it limited the power of Melbuframa back in the day. These magical seals were created by the sister of Melbuframa, this woman named Charlie, who is one of the Wingleys who sympathized with the humans. She's a low-key, possibly the most important person in the plot, because she's also the person who created the magical choker that gives Rose her functional immortality, and she's introduced basically at the 11th hour. There were 5 Signet Spheres, but by this point only 3 remain. One resided in the area known as the capital city of Kadisa, now the Forbidden Land, the place that was destroyed during the Dragon campaign. The second one to be destroyed was destroyed when the Divine Dragon attacked Deningrad. This was the big chamber at the top of the Crystal Palace, and as a matter of fact, during the cutscene you can even see a magic ray come out of the palace and fly to the moon. The 3 that remain are the only thing stopping the world from total destruction. One in the underwater city of Agilis, another in the lost city of Xenobados, and the final one in the death city of Mayfill. And you know I've played this game a lot because I did not even need to consult the wiki to remember those names. And how do the Divine Moon objects fit into this? Well, they were concentrated Wingley magic that individually have enough power to destroy one of the Signet Spheres. You may ask why there were items made to destroy the Signet Spheres if said spheres were used to limit Melbu's power and prevent the God of Destruction from being born. Turns out they can't even keep their story straight. In this same dialogue, they say that Melbu created the Divine Moon objects to destroy the spheres whenever he wanted, and they say this immediately after implying that Charlie made them to appease her brother, whom she still had some affection for. Though to be fair, it's only an implication and possibly just part of a janky translation. So whatever, I choose to believe that Melbuframa created them because that makes more sense. So the entire background plot of the game has been about Zeke finding the moon objects to destroy the Signet Spheres. But now that he has all the objects, we have to race him to the Signet Spheres. So naturally, you go to all these and one by one they're all destroyed either right before you get to them or right as you're getting to them. And in rather quick fashion as well. If you're good, from the point the 3rd disc ends and the point in which the moon falls, it might take 3 or 4 hours. So I feel like they were really rushing to wrap things up. And I feel like the biggest flaw of this chapter is that because there was a lot of mystery surrounding the main plot of the game, there was only so much you could exposit naturally in the first 3 chapters. And that's fine, given what the game was presenting up to that point, it felt like a natural progression of information. But because the major intrigue had been exposited, suddenly there was still a lot of information that needed to be told to the audience in order to get them on the same page and understand all the details of the major overarching plot. So there are a couple of egregiously long text dumps to get us through revelation after revelation, necessary context after necessary context. That explanation I gave you, that was the abridged version. You would not believe how long the in-game version is. It's to the point where they have not 1, but 2 topic lists to run down in classic adventure game fashion. Tell me more about the Signet Spheres. Tell me more about the Birth City Deningrad. Tell me more about the Divine Moon objects. Tell me more about the Death City Mayfill. And all just so they could get you on the same page, and I understand that this was a necessary thing to do because of how much the first 3/4 of the game relied on not telling you much, but it still doesn't make this less egregious. But don't get me wrong, as much as I feel like this is the weakest part of the game, it's by no means bad. If Chapter 2 is a 10 out of 10, this is a 7 out of 10. And there is still a lot of good moments on this disc. A great chunk of the story, although it is completely optional, is the part where you have to help out the previous generation of Dragoon warriors move on to the afterlife as Shirley is holding their spirits together. Because it's a tragic story of Rose having to face her dead friends once again, and as a matter of fact, she has to basically kill them again to bring them peace. The most heartbreaking one is the little girl named Damia, who was a 15-year-old Dragoon who was an outcast on account of being a mermaid-human hybrid, which might have actually been something that Albert was referencing earlier in the game. She looked up to Rose, and Rose was one of the few who wouldn't judge her for who she was. Having to essentially put her out of her misery is so tragic because, well, she's just a kid. Also, shout out to this guy, Suvale? I don't know how that's pronounced. Because he looks pretty much identical to what I looked like in my early 20s, and my god, it fucks me up that I can just casually say in my early 20s now. Then there's the entire sequence in the Death City Mayfill. You see, as the name implies, this is where souls go after they die. And do we know anybody who's died recently? In this sequence, we actually run into the ghost of Lavitz, but he has a suspiciously physical form. It turns out he's being kept corporeal by a demon that latched onto his soul. It's also taken over his mind and turned him into a monster, and stolen his shirt for some reason.
Why'd you take off your shirt?
So we have to break through to him before we can fight the creature that's keeping his soul from moving on. And Lavitz, in a moment of clarity, stabs himself through the chest to finish the demon off. So that would be the second time he got stabbed in the chest. And you get an emotional final goodbye as his physical form is deteriorating, and as a matter of fact, he uses the last of his strength to create a bridge to which you can get to the final sphere. How? I don't know, and I don't care. It was a great moment, and it's nice just to see a final bro moment between the three of them. Lavitz, heroic to the last. I would say it's the highlight of the disc, but all three of the major Wingley cities have their moments that go far beyond this one moment. Another thing that happens in Mayfill is seeing as Rose has killed so many people, you get to see the extent of her reach and how so many wandering souls hate her and want to see her suffer. There's some real dark, foreboding energy there. There's also a moment where Dart even feels the soul of who I think is implied to be his mother, and that's sweet. In Xenobados, you get to see the process by which Wingley laws went through the bureaucratic system, but the system has been on autopilot for 11,000 years, so it's fascinating to see how a bureaucracy runs when it has no guidance. I just wish these guys would stop asking me to wait my turn when I'm trying to ratify a new law. I did wait my turn. You guys are the ones who aren't. There's the city of Aglis, where you interact with Savan, one of the few Wingleys sympathetic to the human's plight, and you also get to see his little helper robots. These things are adorable, and I would even like to see a plush of these. It's also here where you have one of the final character building chunks of the story, with each of the 7 Dragoon warriors being put through a test to prove their courage so that Savan can use their courage to build the ultimate weapon, the psychedelic bomb. Fun fact, if you get all the questions right, you actually get the Psychedelic Bomb X, which can be used once per battle for the rest of the game. Also, I find it hilarious that Rose proves herself to be so innately courageous, they don't even need to do the test. But for all the good moments, in the end, the last sphere is destroyed, the moon falls, and it's actually caught by the divine tree that suddenly shows up out of nowhere, which really just speaks to the idea that this was all God's plan, and you have to make a last-ditch effort to prevent the god of destruction from being born. It's also notable that when the moon falls, thousands of virages fly out in order to protect the moon. It's very good synchronous storytelling to show how screwed the world is, because you had to put in a lot of effort just to kill individual virages, and yet here we are facing down thousands of them. Also, shout out to Kulon, our flying manta ray type creature who acted as our last minute fast travel access, who dies trying to get us onto the moon. Dude's a bro. And once in the moon, it's weird. It's almost as if there's a world within the moon. It's a strange ethereal world built out of memories, the combined memories of the entire group. Hence why a significant chunk of this world is made up of a version of Bale circa 20 years before the events of the game. You even see some familiar faces if you look around. Under these circumstances, everyone has to face one final trial in order to move on to the center of existence, a lot of which isn't the best. A lot of it is either recycled or poorly established. Kongol has to face his older brother in order to prove that he's strong enough to help Dart. And this takes place in the form of a flashback where he's saved by Emperor Dole, followed by a fight in the home of the Gigantos. The whole brother angle came completely out of nowhere. Fun fact, by the way, if you don't get Kongol's Dragoon Spirit before this is actually where you get it. The only reason I suspect is because they needed it for the final cutscene. Albert has to fight Emperor Dole, again, the only difference this time being that Albert gets to find out why Dole assassinated King Carlo, and since this is all a mental manifestation, who knows if it's actually true? And the most asinine has to be Miru, who has to fight the Archangel of the Winglies for her crimes against the Winglies. But the Archangel is only established once in the game, and it's in an optional dialogue. The best one would definitely be Haschel, who has to fight a mental manifestation of his daughter who's possessed, and finally make peace with what he's done. Then there's Rose, who has to fight her old pet dragon, the dragon from which she got her Dragoon Spirit. It shows that when dragons grow old, they grow demented and feral, forcing them to be put down. She was depressed over having to kill her beloved dragon again. A sad story that we can all get behind. Another fun fact, by the way, this area has an enemy that gives you 2000 XP, so if you feel like you're under-leveled, this is the best place to grind. And with that, we're finally at the end. You finally make your way to the core, and the imagery gets more and more surreal, and following a few boss fights, you're finally at the end, the center of the moon. Zieg shows up, takes back his Dragoon Spirit from Dart, and after the fight it's revealed that Zieg had been possessed by Melbu Frama the entire time. His soul inhabited Zieg's Dragoon Spirit during their battle, and after Zieg was unpetrified after nearly 11,000 years, it laid dormant until the Black Monster attacked Neat. Zieg tried to use his Dragoon, which was the triggering point that allowed Melbu Frama's soul to be released and possess Zieg, after which point his plans were set into motion. So far so good. The only issue at this point is that Melbu Frama being the final adversary might be a bit problematic in the sense that if you're not paying attention, you might forget who he is. Like, yeah, he's mentioned a lot through the game, but you only see him once. And I remember the first time I got to this point, I had actually forgotten who he was. I thought he was just some random guy, so I had to look up who he was. But to be honest, who else could have been the final boss? Because Shauna, Zieg, neither of them had enough gravitas to have been a fitting final boss, and yet there was this one character who had so much intrigue and gravitas despite never actually showing up in the game. He was mentioned all the time. He was the instigator of the entire game's mythology going back thousands of years. And he was said to be a god-like powerful being. So having Melbu Frama be the twist final boss was not just the right choice, I think it was the only choice. But this is where things fall apart a bit. They've been building up for the entire chapter that Dart was going to have to make a choice about whether or not he can bring himself to kill Shauna to save the world, and that decision is made for him when she enters the center of the moon and is immediately pulled out while Melbu goes in instead, transforming into the god of destruction. So it's like, once the soul meets the body, anybody can choose to become the vessel for the god of destruction. That's a total cop-out. It completely deflates all the drama, and I feel like there was a way to have made the drama actually resonant, and to make it seem less contrived. I've had this idea written down for years, and some of you may have already heard it, but for those of you who haven't, here's how I would have done it. So after you fight Zieg, Shauna begins being pulled into the core, then after a conversation hinging on needing to stop her, you're given a choice text box, either I can't bring myself to do this, or we have no choice. The former ends with a short cutscene leading to an instant game over, the latter leading to a pseudo-boss fight with Shauna in the amniotic sac. Now you have emotional weight because you feel like you're being forced to kill Shauna, but then nothing works. Attack after attack does 0 damage as Shauna is pulled into the core. Then a scripted event has Rose go full powered in a last-ditch effort to stop Shauna. She doesn't go into Dragoon form, she goes full-blown Black Monster. Because the Black Monster is obviously a completely different form. Maybe that's just artistic license, just to conceal her identity from the audience. But they could have used that as a means to facilitate the drama and establish that the Black Monster is actually like her final form. But then she flies into the orb, attack after attack, and it starts to work. The sack starts to crack. The audience would be on the edge of their seat because they know this scripted event could mean the world being saved, but also Shauna dying. Then, right as she's about to deliver the final blow, she's given the magical equivalent of an atomic bitch slap from the ghost of Melbu Frama as he's leaving the body of Zieg. It was all part of his plan. He knew that she would unleash the Black Monster and it would weaken the walls of Shauna's amniotic sac enough that he could take her place once the embryo of the God of Destruction was fertilized. At this point, she'd be pulled in just like it happened in the game. But he's also able to break the seal right as it happens thanks to Rose and swoop in to replace her right as she enters. This way it's dramatic and it's actually established why Melbu is able to take over. This may also explain why he facilitated a plan that resulted in everyone getting Dragoon spirits, because he needed to build a team of people strong enough that when the time came, they would have the power to break the seal and give him ultimate power. It was all part of the grand plan. But as for what actually happens, once Melbu becomes the god of destruction, not to be outdone, Lloyd, who survived Dole/Zeeg/Melbu's attempts to kill him, attempts to roll up and take out the god of destruction, only to immediately get chumped out. Thanks for coming, allegedly best swordsman in all of Endiness. And this is where things finally come to an end. Lloyd gives you his Divine Dragoon Spirit, which immediately bonds with Dart, which replaces the other Dragoon Spirit. Then you also get the Dragon Buster, which only Rose can use. I'm not a fan of this. I don't like it when games only give you the super ultra powerful weapons right at the end. I would at least like a New Game Plus where you get to play around with them. Regardless, this is the end. And you know, something about this always seemed so biblical to me. I remember years ago when I was listening to the Iron Maiden song Moonchild, a particular couple of lines stuck out to me. 7 angels, 7 demons battle for his soul. While Gabriel lies sleeping, this child is born to die. A lot of weird mixed symbolism that I feel could apply to this game. And that made me look into what those lyrics meant, particularly the 7 angels bit, because our party consists of 7 Dragoon warriors, 7 angels. Now, I'm no expert on biblical matters, so don't take anything I say too seriously, but I'm gonna toss something out here. 7 is an important number in the Bible. 7 deadly sins, 7 holy virtues, 7 seals of the apocalypse. When the 7th seal breaks, it's meant to signal 7 holy trumpeters to descend from heaven and enact God's wrath, as such is written in Revelation 16:1. Then I heard a loud voice from the temple saying to the 7 angels, "Go pour out the 7 bowls of God's wrath." Well, here we have 7 angelic beings at the foot of the god of destruction created by Soa, the god of this universe at the cusp of the apocalypse, except in this version, the 7 angels in question are acting in subversion to what God wants. So from how I interpret this, the birth of the god of destruction is the 7th seal. If they're going for a biblical parallel, what are the other seals then? Well, there are 5 signet spheres, each of which could be considered a single seal, which leaves 1 vacant seal, which I would interpret as moot. The project that Savoy spent 7,000 years on to try and make the signet sphere unbreakable, but with the destruction of Moot, as well as the signet sphere of Aglis, it was a 2-for-1 deal. Then again, in real life, what the seals represent are somewhat vague and often tied to historical events dating as far back as the death of Christ. So if it's not Moot, it could be something else, like the death of the Divine Dragon, or something equally eventful like the destruction of Velweb. And as for the God of Destruction and how this ties in, I believe that represents the birth of the Antichrist, a false prophet meant to signal the Great Tribulation, the end times, and finally the second coming of Christ, because what's more end timesy than the birth of the God meant to destroy the world so it can begin anew? And the funny thing about the Great Tribulation is that it's supposed to last 7 Hebrew years, yet another instance of that number. As far as false prophets are concerned, what's more of a false prophet than the Moonchild creating the God of Destruction, because we spent the entire game being told that the Moonchild was going to bring about a great gift to the world, only to have it be the impetus for the end of the world. And it signals the second coming? Well, there just so happens to be a hero among this group who has essentially come back from the dead, that being Zeeg. There's so many strange parallels. Even the Divine Tree could be a parallel to the Tree of Life in the Garden of Eden. Granted, the Tree of Life is a common thing in different religions, going back all the way to Mesopotamian religions, but either way, there are far too many parallels here to ignore the biblical influences that this game has. What's even the point of bringing this all up? Honestly, I don't know, I just find it very interesting. They obviously had a strong biblical influence when making this final boss. So with that said, we finally reached the final boss, and it's epic, by which I mean it's very, very long. He has 42,000 health, 60,000 if you're playing the Japanese version, which means even with the best additions available to you, it's still probably gonna take 10 to 15 minutes at least. And take this for what you will, it's not that hard. So if you enjoy final bosses being the apex of game difficulty, you won't get that here. If you've gotten this far, there's a very good chance that this part of the game is a cakewalk. It just takes a while. I appreciate how much effort went into this boss fight, though it has several forms, each of which had to be individually modeled, programmed, and implemented. Honestly, it feels like the developers were showing off, and I appreciate that. And I really appreciate how abstract each of its forms are. In one case, looking like some sort of upright machine with a laser cannon, and in another case it looks like a straight-up spaceship, and one of its attacks is to throw galaxies at you. Now that's awesome. And like I said, this is the one chance you get to use the Divine Dragoon spirit, and while it's not as robust in its execution as the other Dragoons, the novelty is enough to carry it. So there's a lot to like, but it's not the game at its best, which is disappointing because it should have been the best. Though the soundtrack for this fight is among some of the best tracks in the game. It's controlled chaos that really sells the intensity of the fight. The only issue is it doesn't loop terribly well, so it just abruptly starts again whenever it needs to loop. But what's really interesting about this boss fight is how it evolves, quite literally. Melbu seems to manipulate reality around you in order to bring you to the beginning of time and showcase the evolution of mankind. Furthering the biblical parallels, this fight showcases the history of the world in 7 stages. There's that number again. And in each of these stages, there seems to be a parallel to the creation myth of the world. God creating the world in 7 days. In the first stage, it was an era of chaos and nothingness, almost as if nothing but light exists. On the first day, God said, "Let there be light." In the second age, we see Earth's creation. In the third age, we see mountains, water, and vegetation start to grow, each matching the respective days of creation. In the fourth age, he creates the expanses of the heavens. The fifth age is when the divine tree starts to grow and the fruit starts to hatch, bringing forth all the flora and fauna that inhabits the world. And in the sixth age, this is where they depict the history of humanity. But human happiness turns to despair and death, which even to this day kind of gives me chills. Which is when the 7th age begins, and this is the really messed up part. This is the depiction of the future once the god of destruction has enacted so as will. The 7th day when God ends his work and rests. This is the world according to God's will. Rivers of blood, mountains of bones, death and destruction as far as the eye can see. This is what you're protecting the world from. It's one of those things that I've overlooked at times, but it cannot be overstated. We are fighting in an apocalyptic wasteland. We are standing on piles of giblets with cascading rivers of blood all around us. That is metal as f***. But you know, just keep your wits about you and you should do fine. Also, don't abuse Dragoon forms, because at some point he has the means to depower your Dragoon form. I didn't know that at one point and almost had to redo the entire fight. And this is not a fight you want to have to redo. But once it's over, that's it. Melbu seemingly still has the upper hand, despite being blown in half, leading to one of the most unintentionally funny moments in the entire game. That never gets old, but Zeeg and Rose decide to fulfill their destiny and use their combined power along with the Dragon Buster to deal the finishing blow, sacrificing themselves while everyone frantically gets away while the moon is imploding behind them. Lots of great moments even in this little scene alone. One of the unsung details that I like about this scene is the fact that Kongol on his own accord decides to grab Miru and basically be her human shield, or I guess Giganto shield. She could totally handle herself, but I just chuckle at the idea that Kongol is like, "Me big, you small, me protect you." I just think that's cute. And it all ends with a final explosion, even if they definitely didn't have enough time to get away from the explosion. But that's besides the point. It's an epic and really well animated punctuation to the game. And then from there, once again, not a dry eye in the room if you're invested in the game. We get a montage of where all the characters ended up after the game, with some sappy yet hopeful music. Kongol, presumably feeling left out, moved to Rogue to become an apprentice of Haschel, both basically becoming the family they needed after they lost their own families. Miranda moves back in with the Sacred Sisters and presumably becomes the heir apparent to the kingdom. Albert marries Queen Emile in a bombastic ceremony. Miru and her husband Guahara move to Lohan. Why Lohan? I don't know. I kinda wish Haschel would have been involved with her and her husband because it seemed like a good fit. But she does fulfill her dreams in being able to openly live among the humans without her fellow winglies objecting. Princess Lisa and King Zawar continue to rule the kingdom of Tiburoa and get involved with the efforts to restore vegetation. Finally, Dart and Shauna, content in each other's arms, help rebuild Celeste. There's even a callback to earlier when Dart leaves a drink at a memorial to Lavitz, which is based on what you think would be a throwaway line from earlier in the game when Lavitz said to Dart that he owed him a drink once the war was over. And throughout all of this, we see that there is a seagull with purple-tipped feathers observing all of this. And when it's all said and done, we see this seagull rest on a perch with a seagull that has red-tipped feathers, revealing that Rose and Zieg were finally able to be together in another life. The end. And this is of course after the credits, which has the full version of the song If You Still Believe, a really good reward for beating the game. Man, this part always makes me misty-eyed, and a lot of that comes down to the fact that the ending is always bittersweet. Seeing all these characters that we've grown to love, and also Miranda, and seeing them be able to settle down in a world beyond the death and destruction that they've been forcefully subjected to for the entire journey, it's nice to see them existing in a better world. But it's also bittersweet because this is the end. We will never see these characters again, because their story is over. And as much as we may love them, it's unfortunate, but we kind of have to let them go at this point. Do they live fruitfully? Do they die of old age? Do the characters ever see each other again? Or do they say their goodbyes and never meet again? Who's to say? We'd like to think that they would still have relationships and adventures, but that's not for us to decide. The only thing we can say is goodbye. Man, so many years of playing this game and somehow the love never fades. It's funny because I go through periods of obsessing over various things. I'll be really suddenly interested in Mortal Kombat lore for a couple of months, then I'll drop it and stop thinking about it for a couple of years. Then for a couple months I was really obsessed with Spyro because I was making a couple of videos on it, and I also kind of fell back into the world and the lore of that. At various times I've been obsessed with Legend of Zelda, Resident Evil, Bully, you name it. But for every period of obsession, there are multiple years of, if not indifference, at least not really thinking about it much, and The Legend of Dragoon is one of those things that I did play yearly for a while, then I found myself taking an extended break that lasted, 5 years, and I didn't really think about it for a while, and yet here I am, having played it twice in the past couple months just for this one video. As a matter of fact, I've said in the past how during the Christmas season I'll usually revisit something that I'm very reverent for because that's the time of year where I feel very reverent as a person, and during this past holiday season, 2024 for those of you who are in the future, I actually almost missed the deadline for bringing out my Spyro video on Christmas because I suddenly had the urge to replay The Legend of Dragoon. And goddamn, I was spending so much time playing that when I really should have been working. And whenever I go back to it, it's like slipping on a comfortable pair of slippers because I know this game and its lore inside out. And no matter how long I step away, I always love it the same way when I come back to it despite everything. Despite occasionally being like, oh yeah, I really don't like that one part. Or, yeah, that character could have been written better. And there absolutely is a lot to love, and there's almost an elusiveness to this game given the fact that it was never really continued. As much as I would love to see more of these characters and more of the world, it's undeniable that there is a beauty in being a single cohesive thing. It's like watching a dying star. Its beauty is all the grander for the fact that you'll never see its like again. It exists as a single beautiful jewel. Never duplicated, never replicated, never cashed in for more sequels, as the metaphor kind of falls apart. And trust me, I've seen a whole hell of a lot of attempts at people pitching sequels or prequels. The common one is a prequel set during the Dragon campaign. I even remember getting into an argument back in the day with the Legend of Dragoon Reddit mod over why that wouldn't be a good idea, my explanation being that we already know how it ends, so whatever the game does, it can't surprise us. Really, I think the only potential place a sequel could go would be with Soa himself being the main antagonist, given the fact that we killed the God of Destruction, which was Soa's own creation for when he wanted to destroy the world and start again. So he would probably be pretty angry that we subverted his will. But you know, that can get pretty messy. I even saw some absolute moron use this as the basis for a pitch, which included a sequel set 500 years later where the only surviving members are Miru, Kongal, and Dart, where Dart is being kept alive by the Divine Dragoon spirit. I mean, the whole pitch seemed pointlessly cynical and miserable. You know what they say, no reference like self-reference. It's one of those cases where I would gladly take more, but a gem is still a gem even if it is by itself, and I'll treasure this game probably for the rest of my life, because it is more than just a game to me. It's an institution of my life, something that through thick and thin was always there for me. It was always a solid, consistent thing for me to come back to, whether I was a socially awkward 15-year-old dealing with high school drama and needed something to get my mind off all the crap for a month's worth of afternoons, whether I was recovering from invasive surgery for a couple of weeks and needed something to fill my time so I wouldn't go stir-crazy, whether I was a hopeless man in his early 20s working a dead-end shitty job trying to save for college, or indeed whether I was basically stuck inside for months on end due to a global pandemic. This was always something I could come back to, and it would just make things all right in its own way. It wouldn't make all the horrors of the world disappear, but it would simultaneously bring me back to a simpler time while also giving me something to cherish in the present tense. Something I could just turn on and feel all right. Something that would drown out all the craziness of the world around me. The Legend of Dragoon is special, and I will admit, a lot of that specialness is probably entirely down to me, and I can't guarantee that everyone will get something out of this, that everyone will feel the same appreciation that I do, but I know that I feel that way, and that's more than enough. But at the same time, I'm sure there are people out there who do feel that kinship with this game in the same way that I do, and to those people, hell yeah. But unfortunately, as big of a project as it was for its time, and as much money and manpower that went into it, it did come out a touch too late. Coming out right on the cusp of the PS2's release, and it was vastly overshadowed. As such, it didn't have the time in the spotlight necessary to gain the audience it potentially could have, and as such, it sort of faded with the sands of time. It could have been a JRPG staple, much like Final Fantasy or Kingdom Hearts. But the single issue of timing caused a ripple effect that prevented it from reaching its full potential. But now that it's been re-released not once but twice, there is proof that there is at least someone at Sony who cares enough. So maybe that age-old dog is still alive. To be clear, those in the know may be mistaken in thinking that this is my favorite game of all time. No, not quite. Even when I took more stock in the idea of categorizing your favorite games, this one was always top 5 but never number 1. But these days I don't really put much stock into quantifying the exact favorites because your favorite games will constantly change depending on a number of factors. So I'll just say it's up there. Though I will say, it might just be the most special game to me. It might just be the single game that I hold closest to my heart, and always will. That said, I probably won't play it for a while since now that I've played it twice in a handful of months, there's only so much I can play even my favorite games. So as cheesy as it is to say, with all the love in my heart, I leave you with this.